Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Will.
And I'm Luke.
And today we are going to be discussing chapters 34 and 35 of Against the Day. Unfortunately, Cody is not going to be able to be here with us this week. He's got some family stuff in town for the holiday, as we are recording this around July 4th weekend, but we are going to do our best to soldier on without him. Luke, do you have a summary prepared for us for these chapters?
I do. Chapter 34. Frank re-enters America, then heads west, either consciously or unconsciously seeking out Estrella Briggs, and eventually makes his way to Nochecita. There he discovers that he has somehow become less than alive. He feels like he is haunting the place, so he continues his pursuit of Stray and journeys to Fickle Creek, which could be called the city that never sleeps, seemingly. Eventually, he does find Stray in a pancake restaurant, although it is immediately clear that she has shacked up with a locally notorious outlaw named Bang Feely. So Frank goes back to Denver, where he reconnects with the Reverend Moss Gatlin, who points out that Frank should tell his mother about him shooting one of Webb's killers. Moss says Mava is living in Cripple Creek, so off the pair go. Once there, Frank and Moss split up, and Frank gets a hotel room in which he proceeds to get drunk until awoken by Groucho Marx's loud antics in the room next door. Frank and Groucho fall to talking, and Groucho shares where Mava can be found at her ice cream parlor, the Cone Amore. So Frank and Mava reconnect. Mava reveals that she has been taking money from the mine owners, then says that she already knows that Frank killed Sloat. The pair reminisces about Webb for a while. This leads into the next topic of conversation, Lake and Deuce, and what should or should not be done about them. Finally, after Frank has left Mabel behind in Cripple Creek, Frank thinks back to what seems to be the highlight of his visit with his mother revealing to him that she almost joined a circus way back in the past. Next is chapter 35. So Deuce and Lake escape Colorado, heading east towards the Great Plains. They eventually find themselves visiting Deuce's sister in his hometown. Having become addicted to Lake's forgiveness, Deuce picks a fight with Lake about his role in her father's death. The pair move on to Walladeth, Missouri, where Deuce is mistaken for a lawman who was supposed to arrive that day. So he becomes a cop, and through his work, finds out that Sloat is dead. He sets off in pursuit of his friend's killers, leaving Lake behind to catch her fellow cop, wife friend Tace up on all the sordid details of her and Deuce's coupling. Next, we get a dream sequence / flashback where Lake catches Mava talking to animals. The two bicker a bit, then Lake wakes up. Deuce comes back from his search for Sloat's killers, having had no success. His return does not reassure Tace that the pair will somehow discover domestic bliss, however. Though she is basically talking to herself, Lake tries to plead with Tace that Deuce is not as bad a guy as he might seem, basically. But Tace remains unconvinced. Lake apparently keeps a diary, and we get a small glimpse into her headspace and her views on her marriage. When we finally get the showdown we have long awaited, Deuce and Lake begin clearing the air between them on the subject of Webb's death. Deuce's tears and cries for forgiveness seem to give Lake a sense of power. Deuce and Lake repeatedly try for a child, even going so far as consulting a Native American shaman and resorting to various quack medicines. Tace tries to reassure Lake that it does not really matter that the couple cannot conceive. The couple's desperation leads to Deuce admitting that he wants to have a child with Lake, at least partially, to assuage his guilt over killing Webb. He also reveals some details about Webb's final days and final hours that only he could know. This causes Lake to freak out and assault Deuce with a shovel. The sheriff and Tace show up to try and calm things down, and Tace points out that Lake is just as much of a bad person as Deuce is.
All right. Thank you, Luke. What did we think of these chapters?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. The first chapter, I mean, it is, as many times as it's been said, as many times as it has been asserted otherwise. This is one of my favorite chapters in this book, just in terms of sheer like quality of sentence level writing. Um, I think there's some depth to the scene, some depth to whatever's going on thematically, but I don't see it that at least it doesn't arise to me as like the preeminent thing I want to focus on. I'm really I'm just spending time chewing on the candy that are the words. And it's it's nice to see Moss Gatlin. It's nice to see Mava. It's nice to see some real perspective on this whole revenge saga, because of course it's like emotionally satisfying to an extent or another, but it is what it is, and it's nice to see something kind of come of it. And the second chapter we're talking about today, I'm less of a fan of, but more because or because it seems like it might have been crass had the whole chapter been written in such a pretty way, because it's kind of just people tearing themselves apart to justify hating one another and themselves in a way. I don't know how to put it more clearly than that. But it's I don't know. There's a certain degree of pretense that almost all novels that deal with this kind of relationship issue get stuck on, that I find very annoying. It tends to get hung up on these ideas of trauma that are a little bit fanciful, and it's nice to see kind of these two characters not suddenly become different than we've ever seen them before. It's not like the change in the context or that this particular moment makes them suddenly, oh, she Lake is the bereaved housewife and Deuce is the put upon husband, or whatever the hell set of stereotypes you're gonna throw together. They're not that, and that's nice. It's really nice, actually, because it would be really easy for you to draw the line in these scenes as this is one person who's truly horrible and this is one person who's deeply redeemable, when no, neither of them are really great, and neither of them really deserve redemption, even if like obviously Lake is in the right when it comes to pretty much all of the questions of blame. It's just that they've done well, crossed the line where blame doesn't matter.
Yeah, agreed. I would say that like if there's probably any set of chapters that we've covered so far for the show in this season on Against the Day that I've highlighted almost the entirety of, this is definitely one of them. Like probably more than any other set of chapters, I have a lot of highlights of just really, really good prose that exists in these pages. I could really essentially just second everything that you said. You certainly said it better than I probably could. But yeah, just I like what you said about just like sort of chewing the candy of these pages on just like a pure sentence level. It's just really really good. And I find that though, as much as I enjoy the stuff with the Chums of Chance and the kind of wackier Pinchonian stuff going on, really the sort of Western portions of this book with the Travers family and everything that is happening in that realm of the couple of different realms this book is occupying is the stuff that I'm most attracted to. Like this stuff that I love reading, especially on just like a pure prose level. It is really those portions of the book that stand out the most to me. And it was really really nice to have a set of chapters that really didn't involve any kind of like research. Like I didn't have to stop reading and look something up or take notes on something. Like I could just sit and enjoy the writing that Pynchon was doing. Because I don't even know, there's probably 60 candidates that you could pick for like a favorite quote from these two sections. It's really great stuff.
Yeah, I really love the language in these two chapters. I would put chapter 34 in probably my top 10 chapters so far, maybe top 5. And I do like chapter 35 a lot too. For various reasons. I mean, I think we had talked about this a while ago where I mentioned something about Mava maybe being a bit flat and or not us not really getting to know her very well previous to these pages. And I think Will or somebody pointed out that we eventually do get more stuff about Mava. So I was pleasantly. I know it's nice to I really like Mava. I guess is what I'm getting at. She has some really fun quirks. We get a lot of dialogue from her. Even in chapter 35, we get some kind of cool details about how she is and stuff. To where she is a lot more fleshed out in my mind now. And that was a problem I previously had, is that she was just kind of not super fleshed out before this. And then I don't know. I have been thinking a little bit about the Deuce and Lake relationship, especially as it's depicted in chapter 35. I mean, there's stuff I like about it, and I do like that they're finally like kind of maybe not breaking the fourth wall is not the right way to put it, but like addressing, like finally kind of clearing the air, I guess, and directly addressing the foundations of the relationship. I just don't know how realistic I find it, and maybe I've kind of maybe feel like I'm focusing on that more just because of how realistic Taste feels to me. Like she, it's mentioned that she has a cigarette, like she smokes cigarettes, and you can just kind of, I don't maybe find it easy to picture her, but I find it really easy like to hear her voice. Like she has a very kind of, I mean, it's not mentioned, but you can just kind of imagine her having this like gravelly kind of older woman who has like a very gravelly voice. I don't know. I do find her realistic, and her interactions with Lake strangely realistic, and I find Lake and Deuce and them fighting and stuff, it's a little bit, I don't know if cartoonish is the right word. It's just kind of melodramatic. I don't know how realistic it is. It really, like, in terms of if this were to actually happen in real life, which I don't know. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't, but I just kind of feel like it would play out differently perhaps in real life. Like their interactions and following them getting together and stuff. I don't know where I'm really going with that, but I mean, as I said, I just don't find it super realistic. Chapter 34, we're back in Colorado for at least some of it, which I like, obviously. There's the West Texas mentioned at the beginning of chapter 34. And I've been listening to a lot of All Hail West Texas by the Mountain Goats, kind of coincidentally. So that was a fun little detail. Anyways, yeah, those are my thoughts.
All right. So jumping into 34, we're returning to the point of view of Frank as he makes his way into Nochecita. And in this early sort of portion of the chapter, we get a nice kind of allusion almost to something akin to gentrification, where it says, new buildings had gone up near Stray's old place, so close sometimes that there remained only narrow slipways for the wind to pass, picking up speed, whereupon the pressure decreased, so much that as the unrelenting plateau wind passed through town, the flimsily braced older structure was actually being sucked to one side, then the other, all night long, rocking like a ship, ancient nails creaking, plaster apt to chip away if you looked at it for more than a second. Walls of the room shedding soiled white flakes, a threat of collapse in some near future. The foundations had gone on crumbling back to pebbles and dust, and rain leaked in everywhere. Little or no heat in the place, floorboards not quite level, and yet the rent here, he heard people complain, kept getting higher each month. Newer tenants continued to move in, earning more and eating better, as the place filled up with factory reps, real estate salesmen, drummers of weaponry and medical supplies, linemen, water, and road engineers, none of whom would ever quite meet Frank's eyes, respond when he spoke, or recognize him in any but the most muted and shifty ways. And so, like, that is obviously very familiar even now to kind of what we go through as a society, especially here in America, as we kind of really expand gentrification from just being in these certain areas, like in New York, as we talked about with the Bleeding Edge section or the Bleeding Edge season, and into just like all different places across the country. That's really accelerated. And I live in a city that is continually gentrifying in a lot of ways due to like new industry, particularly tech industry. And so this certainly rings true to my experience still now. But I think the other thing that is really intelligent about what he's doing here to kind of set up returning to this character's point of view is showcasing how much time has passed just in this book alone, and how much time has passed certainly since Frank was like a young child and since the family was together. You know, the house itself is falling apart, both literally as he goes back to kind of his hometown, but then also metaphorically as well with how the family has scattered and how the father is dead and the daughter is, you know, married to the father's killer. And there's all this tension in a lot of different ways related to that. It's an example of very effective thematic writing, I think, in this chapter. And it just imbues a sense of weight at history in a very personal degree, you know, not world history, but familial history that I found very effective. Like this whole chapter is kind of heavy with the weight of history. It feels like a lot of time has passed, which, especially you know, looking at how long we have been covering this book up to now, we find, at least I did anyway, doubly effective at just thinking back to just how long it was since Frank shot the guy, which was, of course, his last point of view chapter. But it's in my opinion, it's just such a great way to open this chapter, especially with what Frank is going to be spending the chapter doing, kind of kicking up the bones, so to speak, of his kind of prior life.
Yeah, and I really like that you highlighted that paragraph and the way the parts of it that you highlighted because I don't know. For me personally, it's just one of those things that I don't really have like a list, even a mental one, but in my mind, one of those things that's like the hallmark of a great author is their ability to actually capture the sense of, you know, coming back to a place that you once knew and loved, like in your bones. And to actually capture that and not just evoke it is seems really incredibly difficult.
Mhm.
And Pynchon does a really fantastic job in this opening.
Yeah, I like the way you phrase that, Will. I don't know how much I have to add, but I do really love that you pointed that out.
Yeah, and as we go, certainly, given the fact that I think we all are in agreement that the highlight of these two chapters is just the writing in and of itself. Feel free to like interject with any of the quotations that you think are really excellent, and just we can talk about just the craft of his writing if we want. There is not as much to talk about here thematically as in a lot of prior episodes. As any listeners who are reading along with us will also know. So as we go, I'm sure there'll be a lot more reading of quotations from these chapters than is usual for our show. But from there, Frank starts looking for Strella, and as he's going about town, he keeps thinking that he sees her in different places. You know, like the weight of memories that he's experiencing of that sort of former life and his memories keep kind of chasing him around wherever he goes. And eventually, he just can't take the kind of torture of that anymore, and he runs into somebody named Lynette Dawes, who essentially tells him that she's not here, that instead she has actually moved up to an area around a place called Fickle Creek, and that her and her brother kind of separated and went their own separate ways. And now she's with somebody else. And he claims that he's not looking for Estrella, but it's clear that Lynette does not believe him, and that the love that he had for her was very evident to everybody in town. And so he packs up and moves on down the trail, so to speak, to come into Fickle Creek. And another one of my favorite sort of just periods of description is just the crazy hotel that he stays in with all of these denizens sleepwalking around. And there's also a peculiar fascination with motorcycles in this town and in these two chapters in a way. I wanted to ask you guys, especially as we come into contact with the first kind of group of motorcycles, what do you think, if anything, maybe it's just that Pynchon wanted to include them, but what do you think, if anything, the motorcycles represent or are intended to mean in these chapters?
I wouldn't hazard to guess what they're intended to mean, but the way I kind of come at them is kind of a way of like a transposition of the cyberpunk obsession with motorcycles,
Mm.
where they're a symbol of like taking things more dangerously and also not like, okay, the car, the sports car, the muscle car, the American road is this symbol of independence and all these things. But when you're driving a car, it is fuel inefficient. It is, you know, you sure you can turn quickly, but you can't do a almost literal turn on a dime like you can with some motorcycles, even old motorcycles. And sure, you can fix up your car, but it's big. You have to lift it up. You got to have big wrenches and you got to hit things with hammers in order to get them to knock loose. A motorcycle, sure, by the same dint, you might get swept off the side of the road one day, but hey, you can like pick it up with your hands and put different parts on it yourself in a much more like immediate way. And it's kind of like a hyper individualized form of the American road myth that also kind of functions as part of that like wave of gentrification, right? Because it is a midway point. It is the kind of thing that allows someone to operate in a world of cars without having to justify an entire, you know, carriage replacement, right?
Sure, that makes sense. One of the motorcycles that is mentioned within this passage is an Indian V twin. That is an indication that we are at least in 1907 now. For a very long time, we were in 1904, but that motorcycle did not come onto the market until 1907. So we are experiencing some kind of push forward in the timeline because Pynchon is never super specific about when these events are happening, and you kind of have to piece it together from context. Do we have any thoughts on Zoltan being in the bar, or do we think that that is just kind of a funny Pynchon reference being thrown in there? Essentially, one of the patrons at the bar that Frank visits that is filled with all these motorcyclists. One of them happens to be dressed like Dracula, and he falls backwards out of his chair and runs off. And he is referred to as Zoltan, who, of course, was a kind of an arcade machine that would dispense like fortune telling little sort of business card size tickets. It was featured in a couple of movies. Very big, sort of, I guess, almost in my mind, because of the movies, it was in like an '80s cultural touch point. But obviously, it is much older than that. Is it just a Pynchon kind of doing a sort of cultural reference, or do we think there's anything else to that? It is interesting that he is a motorcyclist from Hungary, and then of course there's a lot of that caught up with Shadow Ticket, which if you're someone who believes that Shadow Ticket was at least started in tandem with Against the Day or as part of the composition, there might be some truth to that given the similarity of these two things. But do we have any greater thoughts on who and what he represents?
I don't know about representation, but I would I do just I mean he is a vampire. Just want to make
Yeah,
that clear.
he doesn't
He,
show up in the mirror. Yeah,
yeah, it's an interesting choice because he isn't like any of the things that vampires are supposed to be thematically. He's just a guy who likes to climb mountains on his motorcycle. Like what could that mean?
he's
what is
just wholesome.
what is like this, the symbol of aristocracy and draining the life out of a region, doing just climbing motorcycles or climbing mountains. It's a little weird.
Yeah, agreed. It turns out, though, that Estrella has been above this bar the entire time. That her and her kind of new boyfriend have been right upstairs the entire night. And she comes down the stairs and sort of throws a look at everyone in the bar, including Frank, doesn't acknowledge anything, and then kind of just rides off into the sunset with him. And this is another case of just like really, really excellent writing. Does someone want to read the paragraph on 464 that starts with around the middle?
Around the middle of the third shift, Frank went for some breakfast at the Flapjack Emporium up the street, where it didn't take him long to understand that Stray had been right upstairs all along. With some motor outlaw whose widely recognized blue Excelsior was parked outside, and, well, the contentment in her face when she did step back down again into this pocket-sized eating house, her bearing, her hair, for Lord's sakes, was enough to divide a fellow into two. One saying calmly, "Would you just look at her? How can any man begrudge?" and so forth. and the other wounded enough to soak a whole restaurant tablecloth with the snot and tears of it, never mind who was watching. As she glided on down, the attractively costumed waiter girls, more of them really than the size of the room and the time of night could quite account for, kept throwing her certain glances.
So just, again, really, really beautiful writing in this case about how her presence in a room kind of affects the atmosphere of that room. Yeah, all of the kind of, I don't really know how else to describe it other than yearning that Frank experiences, I think is really, really well depicted. And it goes to show that like there is a yearning not just for her as a woman, but obviously what she represents, I think, in Frank's life of essentially a simpler time. Certainly before he'd committed murder, but also before he'd, gone to all of these places and done all of these things in pursuit of that revenge. And I think that, very clearly the beginning of this chapter sets up this idea of like the old world is gone and this new world that you're living in is here. And for Frank, he is almost in a Gatsby sense, trying to reclaim that somehow through trying to reconnect with her. And I think it's interesting that just she's gone. Like she is not even engaging with him in conversation in a very real and meaningful way. And again, I just think all of this, I'm sound like a broken record, but all of this is just depicted so well to me that it is truly just wonderful to get a chance to read it.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to challenge just one angle there.
Okay.
I agree. There is definitely a level of trying to recapture nostalgia, but I do think that on a different level, just looking at like what drives Frank to go from place to do the things he does, it might be not to say that this is anything other than different, but that it's like he is trying to like he there was this big loose thread that his family left. You know, his dad got killed by these guys. He went and he cut one of those loose threads. He can't quite cut the other one for reasons that we'll get into later, and we all know anyway. But he has to, you know, live with that kind of hanging over his head. And so what's a man with no direction to do except to think, what's another loose thread? Oh yeah, my piece of shit brother who didn't even help me do this thing that I started only because he wanted me to. Well, not only, but significantly because he felt like he needed to help Reef. And in any case, now Reef is off doing God knows what. He'd hoped that he would find find him with Estrella, but I don't. I mean, there were implications before Frank left town that they were going to go splits at least for the short term. So I'm not sure he was expecting that either way. It does seem though like he's trying to, on top of recapture like that history, that stability that he had for like a month or whatever. He's also just trying to like go do the right thing, go talk to his brother, or go be there for this little baby he knew, and
Yeah,
also this girl who he had feelings for that he was really uncomfortable with, and he probably doesn't want to admit to himself that that's part of the motivation, even though clearly at this point he has to admit it.
that's great. Yeah, I I didn't think about that, but that's a very insightful point to add in that he is just at this point searching for loose ends.
There's some of that at like the beginning of the chapter, like the spur line of his destiny.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, which in railroad terms, if someone is unfamiliar, a spur line is essentially like a piece of track that is usually shorter and veers off from the main track. So in that sense, like whatever his final destiny is going to be, he's veered off of it for sort of a short detour, or a short path that he's going to have to return back from. That's a good point, Luke. After this, we are introduced once again to Moss Gatlin, who's been missing from this book for a very, very long time.
Real quick before we get to Moss,
Yeah.
I do think we have to mention, just because it's the kind of thing that would have read as like crass by Pynchon standards back when he was like in his early 30s. The minute where Frank is just staring at the man's penis, and that's the whole idea. There's nothing there but the idea that Frank is just staring at his junk, because
Fair point.
it just seems like something that it is trying to get at a depth. maybe something sociological, maybe something sexual. I don't know. Do y'all have any thoughts?
I mean, it seems to me that like the object of Frank's desire is Estrella, and this is the man who's currently in his mind sort of taken his place in that regard. Like that's the man that she is with, that she's presumably sleeping with. That just like I think if there is a greater depth being gestured at there, it feels to me like it's just sort of, I guess for lack of a better term, penis envy of just like that is I wish that that was me as opposed to this random guy. That is what I would guess it's gesturing at. But you are correct in that there is sort of a younger Pinchonian vulgarity there or crassness there that did I guess I haven't really thought about that very much, but it is true that a degree of some of that really dropped off from his books the longer he was writing for. But that is very much a harkening back to that earlier period of his career.
I do think that small detail, like that, like half sentence or whatever, could like reinforce like the like 'cause Stray kind of has this to me at least has like a post coital glow to her, perhaps.
Oh, sure.
So that would Frank looks at Stray. She seems like in Frank's mind, like we're assuming this, then you like she's obviously like her hair's like mussed or like messed up or whatever. I don't know. Like maybe there's just that's just kind of in the air. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, totally could be that. Yeah, I mean, I think there might be because we know Pynchon loves his Freud. You gotta wonder is is he making some kind of weird joke about Freud's homosexual theories because it's so on the nose.
It is. That's true.
But I don't know what that would mean other than like maybe explaining why Frank is the only of the Traverse kids who hasn't really seemed to have much romance, which is funny in a weird way that is kind of dark.
You heard it here first, folks. Frank might be a gay man in denial.
Well, he might be secretly half of a woman inside of the core of his ego.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I oh, Freud's so fun. If people haven't read Freud, I would recommend it. He's a good time. It's
Don't correct me on that, by the way. I know what I said was not what he said.
might as well be. It sounds right more than anything else.
Yeah.
So so Moss Gatlin reappears for the first time in a long time, and he is driving a horseless carriage, otherwise known as an early car, that is sort of picking up potential devotees of his church. And I guess I also wanted to ask what you guys thought of what he is up to, because I'm not sure I was able to really figure out what the point was of what he was doing. He's certainly sort of in a certain way like carting these people around. He's sharing the car with another person. They seem to be in not necessarily cahoots, but maybe friendly competition over who gets the most money out of that either transportation service or whatever the greater religious thing they're doing is. But I feel like I was not able to get to the heart of what the scheme or the plan is for the two of them. Do either of you have an idea of what is going on there?
So, personally, I don't think there's a scheme. I think, I think Moss has stolen this vehicle. First of all, uh,
I got that impression too. Yeah.
Sure.
but I could see it the other way too. If it's just like this guy is mad that this guy he thought he was working with just repainted the sign and went off rogue. It could just be that. But the I think some historical context might be useful, and I don't have any citations. Apologies, but it was a fairly well documented phenomenon that in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, especially in North America, it was a thing to just go walking for a cause. It was like a callback to the Crusades almost. In a lot of
Hmm.
cases, it was part of the what's the word I'm looking for? The reawakening, but also just like we should stop having slavery. And there would be like a crew of a few abolitionists who would walk from one end of the country to the other, just carrying a sign or something. I'm pretty sure those people mostly got beat up. But if you were campaigning for something more socially acceptable to campaign for, like maybe more slavery, you might get away with it. But those things happened quite a bit, and I think what's happening on the first level is that this other guy who built this rig and is going around trying to collect these destitute people to save them for God as just kind of a campaign showing the glories of God. See, we'll take you in no matter who you are. And Moss Gatlin steals the thing and says, hey, y'all are trying to appropriate the vehicle for revolution, which he may or may not have phrased it as such, but that I think that's kind of the vibe that he's going for, and saying, I'm reclaiming this cart full of invalids as not just Jesus's people, but our people, all of the people of the world's people.
I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think the paragraph that kind of explains things the best, and it actually like I just realized it could be like there could be like a speak of the devil like joke here, because the this is the third paragraph on 466. Jephthah runs this Chrysler road ranch out on Cherry Creek, and this is how he gathers his flock. I thought he was off tonight, it's all right, Jeff, slowing down, don't shoot. So he's talking about Jephthah. Jephthah shows up somehow, even though apparently, Moss didn't realize it beforehand. So it's like speak of the devil appears, perhaps. And that's kind of, obviously probably a joke on pastors who collect invalids and drunk people and everything to fill their churches. And I don't really know if there was historically, if that was the thing churches used to do. I have heard of churches like going to homeless encampments and like trying to like get them, like bringing buses and like trying to get them like to go someplace to like shower and like get food and probably be preached at and stuff. I do think that still goes on, at least some, but I think that kind of explains what's going on there, where like Jephthah would usually use that wagon or whatever it is to pick up randos who in his mind probably quote really need Jesus end quote. And Moss just he says, I thought he was off tonight, so he just commandeers the vehicle, writes anarchists in front of heaven. And I don't really know what his end game was. Was he going to preach to these people about anarchism? Perhaps. I'm not really sure what Moss's end game was, but I think that's what's going on there.
Well, Kate, I wanted to know, do you know much about Jephthah, the figure, the judge? Because I only know like the Google search level of understanding. But it seems resonant, maybe.
Yeah, like I unfortunately I think that there would need to be more context about what Gatlin's kind of end goal is, or like what he is trying to do, because the most resonant kind of thing about Jephthah, as far as like if you were to summarize, which I'm sure the thing that you had read about does, is that this particular biblical character was a judge in the nation of Israel when they were going through and cleansing the Holy Land of all of the kind of various Canaanites and other kind of pagan tribes. And in order to kind of try and make a bargain with Hashem over a victory, was willing to sacrifice his own child, and essentially lost his child as a result of that sacrifice in exchange for a victory. Like, that is the kind of nuts and bolts of that character in biblical literature. So I like I think that there could be something there. I feel like we don't know enough about Moss Gatlin's character to get at it. I think the other interesting thing is that is where he's taking the people to, right? He's taking them to a ranch run by someone with that name, which I think does not bode well for the people there. I would say at the very least there seems to potentially be an implication of those people being sacrificed for some sort of greater cause, in which case that then makes whatever he is engaged in very dark. But it I would need, I feel like I would need more context about what is going on and what Gatlin's purpose is in this to make a greater synthesis about why that person is named the way they are.
For sure. I mean, I don't get the sense that Moss is taking them to the ranch. It seems almost just kind of like the choreography. The only real like orientation we're getting is that the white haired individual Jephthah is like chasing after the truck, which would
Is
kind of
it?
imply. I think so.
Oh,
Chasing them down the
yeah,
street for a
you're
while.
right. Yep.
But I mean, it's still like it. At most, it's Moss reappropriating this engine for that purpose, and Jephthah's the one who would have been doing the sacrificing anyway. So it doesn't mean that Moss isn't also sacrificing them in a different sort of way, but
Yeah.
it might. I don't know.
Yeah. And like Jephthah's an interesting character. Like his mother was likely a prostitute, and the whole thing with his daughter wasn't so much that he like said if you allow me to defeat the Ammonites in battle, I will give you my daughter. It is if you allow me to defeat the Ammonites in battle, I will sacrifice to you whatever it is that I see first upon my return home. And so he comes back home. His daughter is the first person that he sees like running out of his house, and then that creates like a legally binding contract between him and Hashem that he now needs to sacrifice his own child. So it's like there's also kind of like a monkey's paw aspect of that story in terms of be careful what it is that you promise in exchange to God, while also telling a story about like the importance of essentially fidelity to God as well. So there's a lot in that story, but I feel like I just don't have enough information on how to map it to this character or this situation that they're in.
Okay, this is real galaxy brain stuff. Not even like conspiracy corner. It's just connecting.
Okay.
So that's the same dynamic as the worm story in Mason and Dixon. Name of the town is not coming to me, but the English folk tale of the Lambton worm, where he says he
Sure.
will sacrifice the first living being upon killing the worm. And I'm just thinking that's a pretty significant thing. It also links into the the post Iliad, the Oresteia is the most commonly known retelling of it. The Aeschylus play trilogy has that same dynamic of sacrifice for the same purposes at its core. And I'm just there is there whatever there is it is. What one other I guess mention back to the actual text itself is I don't know about you, Luke. Tell me if I sound crazy, but it's a little bit of the goat man in Suttree, right? Like Frank is kind of at that same stage of his life doing similar things. The goat man was doing this kind of thing just with livestock instead of invalids.
It's a good point. And I agree. I mean, there's a few different characters in Suttree that would slot right into Against the Day very easily. And I do kind of forget when Suttree's set, but it does.
These,
Okay, the 1950s?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it would be that. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, like there's somebody else in that book that's occurring to me that's like near the beginning, but it's somebody who like used to run for president as like a joke, which we have those today still. The like like everyman people that like try to go viral basically by, and in the past I guess it would have been like going around and handing out pamphlets and stuff. Anyway, yeah, I mean, and that person also I think in the book went around. That might be the same person. I forget. Yeah. Anyway, I mean, I agree with like I don't really know how to take the whole moss gathering people up thing, as I've already stated. Yeah. I don't know.
So Moss is the one who gets to sort of reminiscing with Frank, and it's here that Frank admits that no one has told Maeva about what happened involving the kind of dynamic with the two murderers and what Frank and Reef have been up to. Even though it seems to have become very common knowledge that Sloat died, and that Frank is more than likely assumed to be the one who killed him. And we get another really excellent description of sort of the ways in which things have changed, I guess is the best way to put it. This weight of history so far. If you've been listening to our coverage of this book, you'll remember that I talked about the Cripple Creek mine strike a really, really long time ago. And just sort of like laid out the history of that in the whole kind of Western Mining Association union battles that existed in Colorado for a really long time. And so as both Frank and Gatlin make their way into Cripple Creek, as we return to it for the first time since all of that, we're treated to this description on 466, where it says, hauling into Cripple Creek, Frank could see how forlorn and beaten down that recent battleground had become. The owners had sure won. The Union had gone invisible if it was there at all, though to Moss Gatlin, it looked like they'd moved on and left a whole population of honorable fighters out of work, and free to make what crawling arrangements they had to get hired again, even for mucker work or likely just to leave for someplace else. Scabs were everywhere, wearing these peculiar South Slavic knitted caps, camp guards stomping the streets they now owned, picking out foreigners they knew didn't speak English and rousting them, testing the general docility level in town. My ministry, he nodded to include somehow the whole off-shift population. These Austrian boys that look so easy and obliging right now will come back as vengeful ghosts to haunt Colorado someday. Because it is a law universal as the law of gravity and as unforgiving that today's scab is tomorrow's striker. Nothing mystical, just what happens. You watch and see. And that's, again, just one of these, as I kind of already said, one of these great quotes that sets up this idea of like how much time has passed and where things are at. Because this is a reflection of true history. And with all of those things that we had discussed in those Colorado labor wars all of those episodes ago, it wasn't just Cripple Creek that got broken. All of those strikes eventually ended or got broken. Now, they made gains for the future, as we've talked about. You know, the reason why we have a 40-hour work week and 2 days off and minimum wage and plenty of other labor advances is because of these things that they used to engage in. But it never led to this like great utopic, working condition, no matter what. The owners always ended up winning in the end. And especially if you've been reading this book closely like we have, this is another one of these elements that shows that the further into history we get, the further into the book we get, the closer to World War I as the big kind of specter that hangs over this book, in my estimation, the worse these conditions get. But at the same time, these things are cyclical. Like the sort of preacher says, yes, it's bad right now, but eventually these people are likely to become fired up union members just like the last group. And then that wheel just kind of keeps spinning. And that, of course, has a lot of implications to Pynchon's greater writing project. But it's another case of again, really solid prose and atmospheric writing of building the overall emotionality of this chapter in a way that I think is really successful.
I do want to point out a few different things about the history of unions in Colorado and stuff. Just about their like the two places I've lived as an adult have been Colorado and Texas, and Texas is obviously going to be I think unions are basically, I think they made them illegal in Texas. I don't really know how that works, but Colorado, whenever I lived there, the teachers went on strike I think as a state, or maybe just in Denver. But people going on strike, like union membership is higher in Colorado than it is even today than it is in a lot of the rest of the country. And some of that, is kind of does link back to the miners and all the stuff that Kate has been talking about in this book in terms of that history has kind of still persisted, not really so much in the mining industry, just I think because it was such a it was basically a war, as Kate has pointed out, as this book has pointed out. it was such a big deal in Colorado's history. I was taught a lot about this stuff, and I think in 8th grade, whenever I moved to Colorado in 8th grade, I think it was either 8th or 9th grade where I was taught a lot about the history of Colorado, and I learned a lot about this era. I think I don't remember basically any details, but yeah, I mean, it's still in this, that history is still taught, and like unions are stronger in Colorado, as I said, still to this day than they are in other parts of the country. So
Well, and I think that's a useful piece of information, and it's I don't know. It feels like it lines up kind of with this weirdness about the Reverend that I understand your suspicion, Kate, but I do think we're supposed to mostly read him as altruistic,
Yeah.
and it's almost like a weird. It is like an inversion, not an opposite at all, not a contradiction or negative, but an inversion of like Nietzsche's slave morality, where he has this like very particular attitude about Christianity, where he's like, I will always claim the people who have just broken all of the edicts that I preach. This is my faith, and that is weird. And I think that is something about like on a cultural level, not to claim any kind of specialness, but insofar as there are cultural differences between, I do think that the Rocky Mountain region tends to be more obstinate in exactly that way, and maybe that's why they stay in the unions. Maybe.
Yeah, I do think he is, at the end of the day, like you're saying, an altruistic force. There's just something weird about what's going on here that I can't figure out,
Oh,
basically.
absolutely.
Yeah. And it seems, I don't know, it seems weird and potentially sinister in some kind of strange way. But I do think that ultimately he is still carrying the torch that he was earlier in the book when he first showed up. After this, Frank is going to plan to go see his mother, but he decides to stop and stay in a place called the Old Yellowstone Saloon before going up to see her. And we just have this like kind of random aside where he gets drunk in his room alone, and then he hears a sound from the room next to him. And who is in there but Groucho Marx, also getting getting not exactly drunk, but having a bad time in Colorado. And this is something that is just based on real history, which I did not know. Before the Marx Brothers formed in the vaudeville act that they would come to be known as, Julius, or who would become to be known as Groucho Marx, was in a completely different vaudeville troupe, and they did indeed go west to Colorado, where they did a couple of different shows. And what Groucho says in this section is what happened. His partner, just in the middle of the night, took all of their money and left, including, I might add, from the historical like society website I've read the story on, stole the money out of his pocket somehow. He was left completely penniless, and he did decide to just stay in Colorado because he couldn't afford to go home. He did drive a grocery delivery cart between Cripple Creek and the other town whose name is escaping me right now. And he did hate it. And eventually, after not being able to like properly settle, he essentially begged his mom by like telegram for money, enough money to buy a train ticket. His mom obliged. And then after he got back home to New York, that was actually when he started the Marx Brothers with his actual brother. So really, if this kind of event in Colorado doesn't happen, we never end up with the Marx Brothers as a vaudeville act. So just kind of a fun, random little bit of history there. It also serves as a neat way for Frank to learn what his mom's up to now, in that she is making, I guess I'll say, artisanal ice cream in town for people, and so Frank kind of knows where to go to really get in touch with her. Just a fun little scene with like a random aside from history.
Yeah, and it's a great impression of Marx Brothers writing too, which is not surprising, I think, to anyone that Pynchon can do a pretty good Marx Brothers impression. But it's just nice.
Yeah, makes so much sense.
I before we get to it, because I don't think it's worth talking about like once we actually get into the ice cream parlor. But I would like to mention that it's kind of like the child safe or the child friendly version of that ice hall that Allie was at earlier in the book.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Just kind of the same dynamic of technology being used as a spectacle to entertain the middle classes. I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Frank goes and sees his mom, and I love the detail that that before he had even kissed her hello, she had him working in her ice cream parlor. As she's making, in this case, cherry apricot, the special of the day. And we we essentially learn that, yeah, she's making ice cream mostly for middle class visitors, and that she is doing it off of the compensation from the mining company. Essentially, that is how she affords all of this. That back when Frank was being pursued for payments by the Vibe Corp, so too was his mom, and his mom, having sort of no choice, decided to take that money and put it to use in starting a business. But she has reached a point of knowledge in town of kind of what she represents as this person widowed by the establishment, and so people kind of tiptoe around her, and people don't really, well, they don't treat her with respect, but they also, it seems like, don't know quite how to interact with her given what she kind of represents and what this business kind of represents as the outgrowth of a truly horrific deed done by the upper class. What do we make of Mava before we read about their conversation about Lake? What do we make of Mava and make Mava's circumstances? She is a character that, as you know, we kind of mentioned at the top of the show, did not get a lot of characterization early on, but certainly kind of receives her due here.
I think it's interesting because it is her continuing not to do the same thing, like in like an economical sense, and also like a functional sense. She isn't doing the same things that she did when she was married and had kids in the house, but she is still functioning in the same social role. She is a person who some people use as an outlet for their frustrations, whose primary duty is to provide comfort to youth. And I don't know what the hell that means, but it's maybe something about who she is, or maybe something about what this hush money means for her life, I guess.
Luke, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I mean, the kid saying poutine, I guess the child's name is, saying we're not supposed to. I mean, and then being cut off. I mean, that obviously leads. I mean, it's probably, I would assume, we're not supposed to talk to you. We're not supposed to speak to you. And I do kind of wonder why that would be. Considering, like, like you said, she's a tragic figure. I would assume that her, like you said, that her position in town and like, her getting money from the mining company is well known. I mean, she doesn't keep it a secret from Frank. I mean, Frank is her son. But I mean, it's because they had lived around that area before, and somebody suddenly owning a business whenever they had previously been I assume a housewife and a mother, and then worked in the service industry the last time we saw her, but not as the owner, I believe, in the last time we saw her. I don't know. I do kind of wonder why Poutine is not supposed to talk to her. Is what I'm getting at. I don't see, like, say the woman was the wife of a mine owner. I don't see why the child can't say thank you or make small talk. I mean, the name Poutine does stand out. I have spent some time in Quebec, and people are, if any Quebecois people hear this, they will probably be pretty angry with me, considering I've spent probably about 7 or 8 weeks there in total in my life in Montreal, mostly. I never had poutine whenever I was there, but I'm lactose intolerant and don't like cheese. But poutine is like a delicacy, is maybe a strong way to put it, but it's a type of food. in Quebec, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like cheese curds and French fries and maybe other stuff too.
Yeah,
Gravy.
and gravy.
Gravy. Yeah. The name does stand out. I mean, are these people, I don't know why they would be. I've never heard of somebody being named Poutine, and it wouldn't make sense for them to be Quebecois if they're living in Cripple Creek and presumably of a higher social class than Mava. I don't know.
I mean, on one, so just the poutine thing. On one level, you've got the kind of idea of, especially at this, when the book was being written, the 90s, let's assume primarily 90s and 2000s. You're probably, Pynchon, as a consummate appreciator of the goofy name, probably loved all of the Kylins and the Troilies that were coming about. And, at that point in time, Denver was pretty, and the surrounding areas were pretty intently. Well, I mean, it's Cripple Creek, isn't it? It's not Denver. It's not even Colorado. Never mind then that.
No, it's
It is.
Colorado. Cripple Creek's
Oh,
Colorado.
oh, okay. Well, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
I think it could just be like that, kind of making fun of the extra E's, I's, G's, and H's. But from the side of like, oh, it's a person who heard a word in another language and thought it was pretty and named their child that, like apple or seven.
And that does go on. I mean, I met somebody named Judgmental in Zambia one time. That does go on.
I like that, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and maybe we can cut this, but the magazine actually just published somebody named Salami, who is Nigerian.
It's a good name.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other thing, again, 2006 is when this book's published. The transliteration in French for a certain Russian politician is just Poutine, like spelled the same way.
Okay.
So I think that might be going on there. I don't have any clue what it would be, but in terms of the name, that's what I've got. But in terms of the why, I think the I'll say something unrepublican is kind of the trite and accurate answer on some level. Like the idea that you don't want the kids to have this person who is a known union man's wife or widow, talking to your kids. I think on some basic level there's that. But I think on a just because I give Pynchon the faith that he thinks on this level, a middle class mother is annoyed by her children. No offense to any middle class mothers, and especially any who aren't annoyed by their children, but any parent is annoyed by their child, and especially a middle class mother who doesn't have a reprieve from their children. They're going to be tired of them all the time. And they just kind of get used to telling the kids to shut up and to not annoy the people around them. And also, like, don't talk to the help. Like, it's gross. You're above that. Like, I think all of those might be going on in this scene. I'm giving a lot of credit there. It's pure speculation, but that's what I would read into it myself.
Yeah. Especially the don't talk to the help part. Like that feels super evident.
I agree.
Yeah, she's such an interesting figure because there's a lot of ways in which you can look at her accepting the money from the mine company as like a, oh man, you sold out, or like, oh man, how could you do this? They killed your husband and now you take their money, but like, there's the other reality of like, what else is she supposed to do, right, at this point? Like one of her daughters is off, with her husband's killer. One of her sons is in Germany, certainly not in a position to support her. One of her sons, Reef, has disappeared doing who knows what, and her other son is off, on a revenge quest. At this time in history, there is very little opportunity for women to make their own money or to have their own estate or to really have any kind of upward mobility that still was sort of on the horizon for them. And so like there is a quiet dignity to her character that, despite the fact that she is taking this money that is certainly within the book's lens up to this point seen as like a very poisoned object, to at the very least create this kind of life for herself now that she is, you know, essentially alone, and that she is willing to accept that in order to just spend the rest of her days in a degree of contentment, you know? And I appreciate that because it shows the ways in which things like this are far more complicated than an idealistic mindset is often capable of perceiving it at first glance. And I think it is, again, as we use this phrase all the time on the show, a hallmark of a lesser writer who probably would not include that, or would not maybe give Maeva that dignity in that way of still holding her head high despite the fact that she's disrespected by the community, despite the fact that she's effectively lost everything, and that she exists off of a stipend given to her by the sort of malevolent entity that destroyed her family. I think that's really the hallmark of a very mature and very masterful writer. You know, she has no illusions about what she's doing. She knows exactly what it is, but she also knows that it is the only choice for her at this point, and that she needs to make her peace with that. She is certainly, in history, she is far from the first or last person who will have to do something like that.
Yeah, I mean, just the whole shape of their conversation as Frank is dealing with the fact that his mother, like, obviously it's not like he idealized her as the rebel.
Hmm.
Like she was the safe parent. She was not the person who he looked to right the wrongs of the world. But she was but she, it is him recognizing, on a very long delay, that his mother is flawed in ways that he doesn't see eye to eye with her. And that's not to say that, as you said, it isn't a mark of maturity to be able to cope with that kind of nuanced sacrifice that is being trapped like she is. Because, yeah, at that point, find the contentment. There's no point in hating your life. You're
Yeah.
not going to make it any better by being shitty. But, at the same time, Frank is someone who's spent the last, like, year or two just wandering around on this revenge quest, and to see the complete opposite of that, and the true negation of that kind of desire, because she's like, yeah, sure, I'm glad you did it in principle, but I really just want us all to, like, move on in the end.
Yeah.
That would be nice.
I want to be able to spend whatever last years I have left talking about something other than this. Which, of course, provides us a nice segue into what they do talk about, which is not something other than this. It is this, and they kind of start by talking about Webb and whether or not he may have been the Kieselger kid, that phantom dynamiter, and maybe that's why he disappeared all the time, and maybe that's why he had this kind of like desire to save the world, or cause some sort of big change in how things are done. And then, eventually they get around to Lake, and I love how simplistic Maeva's response is here. We can kind of talk about this in two parts, but does someone want to read the final paragraph on 470, starting with "Sure thing"?
Sure thing. You boys are hard work, but that's only hard work. A daughter pretends to be so easy. A little lady, smiling, dancing all the time, she's waiting on that perfect moment that'll hurt the most. And Mercy did it. With light in her eye, now warning Frank, it was all she had to say about it, at least to him.
And I think that's just a great sort of companion to the kind of resigned way that she is dealing with her life situation, as we've just kind of wrapped up talking about. That this is all she has to say about, like because what is there to say, in a very similar way. She could be mad, she could scream and yell, she could wish that Lake had done anything else, but that will not substantively change anything. This is going to be the way that it is. And the only thing that she can do, because again, with whatever time she has left, is just make her peace with it. And it is a reflection of, I think, a very strong woman in the context of this book, who is capable of just making her peace with these things as they are, accepting that there are things that she cannot change, and just and finding a quiet dignity for herself. She's really turned into a good character or a great character in terms of her writing in this just this one sort of scene, and done in a very simplistic, very subtle way, which is great to see. So, did you guys have any thoughts on their conversation about either Lake or Webb?
Well, I wanted to say that the moment where it's broached by the narration, that like Maeva has had to reassess all of those arguments that she and Webb had over the years. That there were all these things that she had just assumed were him being, in a way, just a shitty guy, just staying too late at bars or hanging out with painted ladies, when he was actually genuinely trying to do something that she doesn't, in the way it's portrayed, doesn't seem to have any issues with, outside of maybe the practical matters of like risk and fear for loved ones, and you know for her children, and maybe like, hey, if you hadn't done so much, maybe you would still be alive. But there is like the complication. It isn't something where you get the sense that Maeva learns, or like puts the pieces together, that he was this phantom dynamiter, and says, well, yep, of course he was. He was an angry, bitter man at home, so of course he was an angry, bitter man out there. Of course he did these horrible things. This is one more reason to not feel bad about his loss. It's instead, no, he was dealing with things. He wasn't just taking the office home with him, so to speak. He was actually like driving a wedge between himself and the world in a way that kind of prevented him from being honest with her, in a way that perhaps she doesn't take any blame for, but she certainly doesn't feel good about how she acted in the time, at least in the particulars, even if all of the big emotions about abandonment or whatever, what have you, would all remain roughly the same. It's still kind of depth that changes it completely. And I think it's beautifully efficient, because I couldn't point to the lines where that's conveyed. It's just kind of throughout a couple of sentences.
Agreed. And of course, before we wrap up this chapter, we are told that at one point, Maeva had a dream of running off to the carnival, um, and that she was going to be running a horse race game called the Hippodrome. And at some point, that dream kind of faded as she realized that she was already living in a carnival, and that carnival was her family. It's a very sweet sentiment to end this chapter on, I think, especially a very revealing one of Maeva in a lot of ways, not just in in that statement, but this kind of ending of the chapter. What do we think of her dream at one point to run away to a carnival, and her admission at the end of why she stayed?
I really like I almost cried whenever I read the end of this chapter. I don't have children or anything, but just thinking of my own upbringing and my nieces and nephews and stuff. And, like right in the carnival, I find that in is it's italicized. It's very effective. And didn't even know it. I mean, that does kind of smack of like a lot of times. I mean, there have been times in my life when I've been like, oh, like things are going really well, but some of the best times in my life I didn't really realize were the best times in my life at the time. I think that's kind of what Maeve is getting at there a little bit, was that as much as she wanted to join the carnival or whatever, like what she actually wanted was to be with her kids. And I think she's kind of communicating that she doesn't feel regret over not joining the carnival. And that she's glad that she stayed and raised her children, which just kind of endears her to me even more. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in these two chapters, but especially this chapter that I find very endearing about Maeva. But I don't know. I really love the end of this chapter. It was one of the most emotionally affecting ends of a chapter that I can think of in Pynchon's whole oeuvre.
I mean, I this is one of those great examples of how like you can appreciate things for completely different reasons. Because personally, on an emotional level, this section doesn't really hit me very hard. Like, it feels well executed, but it feels like kind of a paint by numbers of, well, here's the thing that you learn about your parent that reminds you that they were once a child kind of thing. And it's well done. I'm not criticizing it. It's one of those things that is done and it serves a purpose, and that purpose is executed. But at the same time, I think because I'm the one who has invoked the term Menippean satire before, I need to mention another big, big word, carnivalesque, which kind of brought brought to us in book studying circles by the same guy, Mikhail Bakhtin, who was a Russian theorist, I guess, literary theorist. Basically, the carnivalesque is one of those things that is often used to characterize Pynchon's writing in general. And I think there's something of a deeper meaning of the Maeva saying that she was in the carnival as being more of a statement of perhaps even a cosmological perspective, but more, just because, again, like, oh, this is against the day. It's a book. It's a book that says it's a book. It's a book that's about being a book. That nonsense. I think you can say that. Oh, in the world of Maeva, she is in a carnival, but also in that middle ground that this book is so good at hitting. She's living in a frontier town. It's a carnival in the way that Bakhtin talks about, which is, just to give a very short summary, it's the idea that in the medieval period, in feudalistic cultures, because of the extremely rigorous economic system that drives everyone to be very segmented in the way they operate their lives, when you have a public holiday, it led to people creating mass social changes just kind of in the moment. And it's the kind of thing where, oh, the town fool puts a crown on and you all treat him like he's king for the day, or you all you get rid of gender norms, like you allow men and women to interact without any kind of sense of contradicting social mores, because it's the carnival. It's a different space than normal reality. And I think that Pynchon might be kind of getting at, this is what the frontier is as a thing, which is not a new idea, but it is well done here, I think.
Agreed.
And this has nothing to do with really anything, but I do really just love the word hippodrome.
It's a great word.
Definitely.
It rolls off the tongue. It's really nice to look at for some reason. I just really like that word. Yeah.
That's a great. Kate, did you have more to say about this?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Then I would like to use that as a springboard for my true conspiracy corner of this
Okay.
chapter.
Электромузыкальный инструмент терминвокс – это первый инструмент такого типа.
So there's this book that we keep, that Cody and I have mentioned a lot in talking about Against the Day, that Pynchon has given great credit to as an influence, called Warlock by Oakley Hall. And there's a lot of things in the Western sections of this book that are clearly taken, obviously not stolen, or stolen in a good way, from Oakley Hall in the characterization of the West and all of these scenes, especially with Frank and Reef. But there's another kind of thing that I don't know if it's an influence, but it is just a parallel. Anyone heard of this little show called Deadwood? Well,
Mhm.
I truly suspect that David Milch, the showrunner of Deadwood, was trying very hard to do Pynchon things in Deadwood, because he had been working for a very long time in television, and had been running a lot of television shows. And Deadwood is the first one where it feels like he is doing the same kind of true ensemble cast, the same kind of true, the like, it's not the city is a character or the town is a character. It's all of the people are the town. All of the characterization is mediated through this function of civilization, and you can't escape it. It's part of the story, and that's something that Pynchon just revels in. And in any case, when Deadwood ended, the next thing that David Milch went on to write was this show that got shut down about horse racing. And the reason that show got shut down is they killed too many horses just filming the first couple episodes. And Hippodrome is a horse racing event where I think traditionally up until this point in time, you would just run the horses until they died. And I don't have any therefore to that, but I think there's a parallel here that's very, very salient, and it's funny to me.
Sure. Do we have any last thoughts on chapter 34 before we move to 35?
It's all very much written in that kind of Western accent, and
It
that's
is.
yeah. I like that.
Yeah, he's done it at least once before in a very meaningful way, but I feel like these two chapters especially really lean into it. And I mean he knows what he's doing too, because there's that kind of brief like aside where he says, if this were like a dime store cowboy poet story or something like that, they would say that the motorcycles echoed off of the mountains or something along those lines, which is like definitely sort of a cliched descriptive phrase that I have heard used many times. That was really a moment that made me laugh. Okay. Then we'll move on to chapter 35. So as we shift focus to our last chapter of this episode, we also shift focus from Frank and Maeva to Deuce and Lake. And I kind of wanted to start out with this chapter in just kind of asking for what your guys' general thoughts are on the character of Deuce. Because like this is probably the closest thing that we've gotten to like a true POV of his. Like he has been in the book before, obviously, and he has given us some internality around the decision to kill Webb and then also the decision to marry Lake. But this is really the kind of the closest we get into his psyche. So much so that when I started reading it, I actually messaged Cody and I was like, I swear to God, if Pynchon manages to make me feel like bad for Deuce, I'm going to be mad. Because if I don't have my hatred for Deuce, what do I have left? So I wanted to begin by just kind of asking you guys your impression of him as a character and also just kind of your impression of their relationship as it has led to this moment. Because this is kind of a defining chapter for him and their relationship up to this point in a way that I think is really interesting, and we can get into the specific nuances of the writing that Pynchon uses there, but I think at the end of the day, what we come away with in our impression of them and their relationship is probably what's most important.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I do think that Deuce has this quality of like, I don't know. There's like this. Maybe it's not even just American, but I mean, there's at least in America that I can tell for sure. There's is kind of like an archetype of like this, like a man from a small town, a guy from a small town, who, whether or not he escapes the small town eventually, is just kind of like a ne'er do well asshole who can't get out of his own way. I don't know, and so I do think that that just kind of solidifies Deuce as that kind of. This chapter just kind of solidifies Deuce is that kind of guy. Like this whole thing about like, as I phrase it, I think in the summary, like he becomes addicted, and as Pynchon kind of points out, he becomes addicted to asking for forgiveness, which is just like a really, of all the weird kinks and fetishes that Pynchon depicts, that's kind of one of the more disturbing ones to me. And it's very telling about his character that like he's a ne'er-do-well. Like he doesn't have a shit together. He's never gonna have a shit together. And I mean, that also comes into play with Tace and Lake later in the chapter. With the whole, Lake being like, I can fix him, and Tace being like, are you fucking kidding me? Basically.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's something kind of tragic about Deuce too. I don't know. It does kind of lighten my view of him somewhat. The tragedy of his character, where he this whole thing of like wanting to have a kid with Lake because it would somehow like please Webb or like, like assuage his guilt over killing Webb or make him killing Webb right. Lake immediately responds in a very appropriate way as like, what the fuck are you talking about? How like that isn't a thing. But I don't know, like Deuce's that is the kind of like misguided trying to do a good thing but not even knowing how to do a good thing or how to be a good person. Like no one ever taught him how to be a good person. Like I'm sure he wasn't raised well. I don't know. That's not really depicted, but he can kind of read between the lines that I don't think, either he was just always a fuck up who was difficult to deal with, or his parents fucked up raising him, or both. It does kind of strike me as like, he never really stood a chance in some ways of just like succeeding, I guess. I don't know. It's not surprising that he turns into a cop for a while there, even if he cons his way into it, basically. I'll have more to say about him becoming a cop whenever we get to it.
Yeah.
But that's not gonna that wouldn't, somebody joining the police doesn't necessarily endear them to me either. I don't know. It is kind of I do find myself like I said, not hating him quite as much, but he's just such an idiot. I don't know.
Well, I think you're correct in that like there is something tragic about him as sort of circumstantial to his upbringing, because there is what becomes evident in this chapter is that there is almost something about him that is this like American dream. I am going to make something of myself. I am going to like escape the bounds of my upbringing by taking some degree of radical action, like to his character. Like that is why he leaves home and tries to do something else, but he ends up getting kind of sidetracked into murdering people and into being this, ne'er do well, as you put it, because that's all that ends up becoming available to him. Like, but that is not what he set out to do, which I think is interesting. There is a degree, I agree with you, that is introduced in this chapter of tragedy, whereas before you really have no reason to assume that he's anything but just like a dickhead.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a complete shot in the dark. I have not read any of the books relating to this character, but the superficial vibes I get from every time I've ever heard someone talk about Updike's rabbit is kind of Deuce, right?
Oh, sure.
Is that off base?
There is some similarity there. I don't think it's totally off base to think about it that way.
Yeah, it's not one to one at all, but like the same kind of attitude. Because
Yeah.
if there's like if there is a single sin that characterizes Deuce, it's pride, and it's pride as manifest in like cynicism towards other people, right? As we get to later in the like the very end of the chapter, his just the only justification he can give Lake is this kind of thing that it's just him taking people at their word, which is a kind of like naive cynicism that is incredibly like, and it's incredibly typical of the baby boomer generation, as we would kind of frame it, as all people younger than them, who want to engage in some generational warfare. But it is like this thing that happens in particularly in American society, but I'm sure in plenty of other places, where these guys just kind of like, they aren't evil people. They don't want necessarily to hurt people, but they have been so failed by the world around them and are so unwilling to give peace a chance, man, that they just kind of do the worst things possible. And
Mhm.
there's no sense of the weight to it. And then they're stuck and they have to justify that somehow. And I love the depiction of his self-justifying, because I think that's the tragedy to me. Because sure, poor kid grew up without a real chance. Sure, that is sad. It's also like it happens. I kind of assume anyone who takes a random hit out on some, or takes a job to take a hit out on someone, is going to be that kind of loathsomely tragic. But like he is he is also someone who has some agency and does deserve blame there. It's just that we see him at this point starting to actually come to terms with what he's done and recognizing that he didn't that's not what he would have done if he could go back.
Right.
And the depiction of that, I think, is really nuanced because, and I don't want to misspeak here, but I do think that like it gets at the ways that genuine grievance does impede social healing, but also just healing of people. Because there are numerous moments in this chapter where you can tell that Deuce is responding to something that Lake said to him years ago, or at least, in the previous conversation.
Mhm.
And he's trying to make up for his previous insufficiencies. But he is so bereft of any real meaning in his life outside of this horrible situation that he has put himself in, that he can't help but, and I think the addiction to forgiveness is a good way to put it, but in a more like compassionate from his perspective way. He can't help but focus on all of the things he's done horribly wrong. He can't help but feel this weight because he doesn't see Webb's ghost, but he knows it's there,
Yeah.
and that's almost worse, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And so he's just it doesn't make me like him anymore, but it does. It's the thing that Pynchon does that is so well done. That he doesn't have cartoon villains. He doesn't even really have evil people. The most evil people there are in his books are people who you can diagnose them. And it's not as in to say that they are like medically disordered or that psychology is the solution or psychiatry is the solution for them. But it does mean that you can look at it and see how things might have been different. And you can hold that base level of human dignity for them while still condemning all of their actions.
Yeah.
And that's not a unique trait, but it is it's a very Pynchon one.
Yeah. He is very invested in creating villains that have like a heavy karmic debt. That is certainly his kind of bag for them.
Yeah. And it's the way their relationship falls apart is so weird because it is like this microcosm of what I'm going to call like modernization destroying culture, not necessarily destroying, but changing it irrevocably. Because it is like in the same way Lake would have had a rebellious period in her youth in a slightly different time period. And then eventually she and her father probably would have settled things without a further escalation of venom or violence,
Yeah.
just because we know those characters. We can imagine Deuce not having made this devil's bargain, meeting Lake and them actually being a good fit, and this scar that brought them together in the first place is exactly their fault line, and beautifully rendered.
Yeah. Well said. And I think especially in terms of what you had mentioned earlier about his sort of like coming to the realization that if he could do this over again, he would not have killed Webb. I think the other important aspect of that kind of unifies what Luke was talking about and what you had mentioned is the fact that like he killed Webb on spec, right? Like he was not contracted to do it. In fact, he had to justify the killing to the mine owners association after the fact. And so like it isn't just the fact that he engaged in an extrajudicial killing for the purpose of defending capital and ended up marrying that person's daughter. It's also the fact that he knows deep down inside that this was a killing that like he just did rather than it being something that he was specifically asked. Like he has no one else to put that guilt on. He can't blame a contract. He can't blame the person who hired him to do it. He is just left with that on his own.
Yeah, and in a weird kind of psychologizing way, the fact that he is such a broken person that he doesn't really have principles is interlinked into his choice to double down, right? His intuition leading him to go, well, then I should kill some more people, maybe, even if he doesn't actually follow through with it in such a
Yeah.
cold-blooded sense.
And it's that I'm glad you mentioned that portion of it too, because like that is such a obvious like absurdity, right? Like like the idea that you would have the thought of, well, I'm really saddled with grief over this one particular death. I guess I could make it less intense if I just increased the number to a greater quantity, and therefore he's just one of 1,000 instead of one of 10 or whatever, right? Like that is like the method of psychological coping that represents without having a lot of attention paid to it, and instead of just having it being written out in that line is, I think, a really smart way of showing like not only the pain that he's in and the kind of restitution or reconciliation he's trying to make with both himself and his wife, but also his incredibly disordered thinking in the first place. Like it
Yeah.
really serves well for both of those things.
Yeah, and I mean, and on like the micro scale of the kind of the broader things I was mentioning, and all of us have mentioned earlier, the the specific way that like the fact that Deuce is finally starting to feel things like as a person, he like something about this like obsession with forgiveness has like jump started his sense of morality on some level. It isn't just like again. I'm not trying to say that it isn't accurate to say that it's an addiction to forgiveness. It's just that on a like a deeper level for him, not deeper, but on a more nuanced level, he is coming to terms with humanity for the first time, and that's
Yeah.
what he's really struggling with. And him trying to voice that just makes Lake more bitter because it shows that he had the capacity to not be the person that she has written him off as.
Yeah. Yep. Very true. And then that, of course, provides additional challenges because for her, she doesn't even really like him all that much, like as a person, except for it would appear like the sexual element of the relationship, like that line about I don't know how the preamble, but when he put his hands on her, oh Lord, then like it is very clear that like there is a very Pynchon's used this dynamic a lot in his books, but that there is something related to his I'm going to say evilness leading into the sexual side of their relationship that she is truly attracted to rather than him as a person, right? And that's very similar to like a Nicholas Windust or a Brock Vond. The very similar things are happening there too. But this element that you bring up, and I'm glad you did, I think speaks to an additional layer of complexity between these two characters that is not present necessarily with those other two characters. Brock Vond has, of the three of them, I would say the least complexity in the relational realm, as it's written in the book. Nicholas Windus does have some complexity, but it isn't with Maxine. It's rather with this other family that he rescued when he was in Nicaragua. Whereas this is really this dynamic that Pynchon is writing about, and the complexity of it is just playing out between these two characters, between this woman who has attached herself to him in that sort of model that Pynchon has laid out before, but is now stuck with trying to make that work, which I think is the other thing that separates this relationship between the other two that I mentioned, because she is, that's her husband. Like she is going to be stuck with him for a very long time, and like Fernesi and Brock are together for a very long time, but we don't see that struggle play out really in any meaningful way. So with all that being said, I suppose we can jump into the chapter. Lake and Deuce are still on the run, trying to figure out what to do with themselves now that the company's going to be coming after them. And we have a brief stopover at Deuce's hometown in Illinois, and there's some again very beautiful writing throughout this entire sort of opening portion of the chapter. And it turns out that he has not been there very long, as we kind of talked about at the top of our discussion of the chapter. He hated where he grew up. He really resents his upbringing and wanted to escape it. And so for him to try and go back to that place that is supposed to be kind of safe, but that he can't exist in is a source of great pain. The conversation that he has with his family about like where he's been the whole time is particularly interesting. how it's just something that's easily brought up and then dropped. And so it's not something that can last. He can't stay there. And so the two of them decide to light out again and try and find a different place to stay. And eventually that leads them to the town of Wall of Death, Missouri, which is a town that was basically built up around a carnival, and the carnival left, but the town is still there. And this is where they choose, to kind of set up shop, so to speak. But before they get there, there's a very crucial conversation that occurs between Lake and Deuce, where they finally kind of broach the fact that Deuce killed Webb all those years ago. And I was wondering what this conversation, if and when it ever came up, was going to be like. I don't think I could have guessed in a million years that I would have been this satisfied with what that conversation looked like, because this feels as realistic as this dynamic can be. The conversation between the two of them about the fact that Deuce killed her father, when they kind of lay out their cards on the table, feels very realistic to me, even though, of course, I've never come in contact with this kind of dynamic before. So I wanted to ask you guys, in this sort of scene before they get to Wall of Death, where they're just kind of talking, how do you feel about the way that Pynchon handled this sort of confrontation between the two of them? Because it really sets the rest of the chapter in motion.
I guess I find it. I don't find it all that satisfying. I find it almost dreadful. I guess it reads as like, sure, she's closing in, and it's satisfying in that kind of plotting sense way. But at the same time, it's that to me the thing that makes it so dreadful rather than satisfying, I guess, is that all of the things that are making her connect the next dot, like not necessarily like making, but the lines in the conversation that are pushing her to confirm her own assumptions are those lines where like it's both of them trying to be vulnerable with each other almost.
Yeah.
And it keeps backfiring, and that's crazy. Like it's not that crazy. It's not that abnormal. It's just dark to read it portrayed so accurately.
And that's funny, what I find satisfying about it. The fact that he doesn't go for the easy sort of catharsis and
Sure.
instead portrays this in a way that feels very accurate to how couples in crisis, for lack of a better term, may talk around something requiring a lot of vulnerability, especially if that couple is already prone to not necessarily be vulnerable with one another. But I agree, your description of it is I think apt.
Yeah, there's two paragraphs. We're talking about the conversation on 474 to 475, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, there's two paragraphs on 475 I really like. Anybody ever cry for you, Deuce? Waited for him to shrug. Then, well, I mean, it's kind of funny that she just assumes he's going to shrug. But well, I hope you're not counting on much from me. I'm done with all my crying. Must have been that my paw took the last of it. What do you think? My tears have all run, and the drought has set in. Whatever happens to you, I guess I won't be crying. That be all right with you? I really like that paragraph. I mean, some of it is a little bit like this kind of thing you might like repeat to somebody. Like if you're repeating a conversation to somebody, you might say that you said something like that, and in reality, you might not have been quite as eloquent. But I do really like, especially the "anybody ever cry for you" dudes is just like such a like. I mean, it's just a rude thing to say, especially with the italics on anybody. She just, and then I do really like the second paragraph. I really like is the one that starts with "he understood," where it talks about how Deuce knows that he should just dummy up, should just cut his losses and not pursue this, not not reveal more about his past and his possible connections to Webb, is how I interpret it. Where he basically just says it, but he doesn't actually say it. We'll be more clear with each other later in this chapter, but that whole thing about like knowing that you should cut your losses, knowing that you should just dummy up, not reveal stuff that's just going to hurt the other person and that you can't do anything about, and that I don't know. It's like I don't know that I find that very like it's a very human thing to do to, like pursue a fight whenever you shouldn't, and that for the sake of the relationship, it's not that you shouldn't do it, but like I think we've all been there at least once in our life where that's happened. It's either happened to us or we've done that.
Yeah.
Pretty much everyone. I don't know. I just really like those two paragraphs, and the whole conversation is really interesting because it does, like the beginning of it, your father's still kicking Deuce. That's a pretty innocent way to begin a conversation with your romantic partner, and then you know, she asks him if he misses his mom, and he says, "Guess so, of course." She ever cry on your account? Cry, not when I was around. And then it's anybody ever cry for you, Deuce? It's like like that first that anybody is, and the way I hear it, it's like almost like a schoolyard taunt or something. I don't know where that conversation really turns on that italicized word and that phrase.
It does. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's almost like when she's starting the conversation, she's looking for a reason that he might have done it. She's looking for something that gives her a reason to either believe in a way that she can maybe forgive or at least comprehend, or blame him entirely, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, what she gets is something much weirder.
Well,
And
it's the first of many times she's going to do that because she tells Taser like later in this chapter, like, well, like maybe he had a gun like pulled on him, and she is looking for any possible reason to write this off.
yeah, and the kind of the really screwed up part of it is that she kind of like this is something that it's not got into in all that much depth, but she kind of hates like the reason Deuce goes in on the spec job rather than waiting for the order is that he kind of gets the hatred that Lake has for him. Not
Mhm.
obviously the same, but Webb's sitting there telling him all these things, trying to be his dad. Hey, fuck you, you're not my dad. Hey, screw you, you're an old man, you don't get it. Sure, you're a union boss, so sure, you get a good wage. What about the rest of us who have to deal with the, only getting shifts when y'all are sick or something? That's probably a little bit too modern of a specific quarrel, but like that dynamic is there on the pages, and it kind of the same deal with like kind of not the same, but it is similar kinds of frustration that lead Lake to cut Webb off in her own life. And it's the kind of thing where, again, I don't think you're gonna get someone to forgive the guy, but I do think when you're looking at what brought them together, it was this kind of horrible self-hatred on both of their parts and this mutual desire to punish themselves. And so it's one of those things where like, yeah, the relationship was never going to go well, but it's not necessarily because they don't see eye to eye. It's more because like she like had all of these she had emotions when she was a teenager, unlike Deuce, you know.
Yeah. Do we have anything? I know we kind of already talked a little bit about it. Do we have any other thoughts we want to add to the like Deuce becoming addicted to her forgiveness? Because that does start out this portion of the book. Or do we feel like we said everything that we had on that?
Just to say it, I guess. I mean, it's since the last couple of chapters, we had so much reference to dialectical reasoning. It is the kind of the dialectical negation of the way that women are, you know, pushed to believe themselves to be angels. Like it is a very flat reflection of that same dynamic. It's just a much more pathetic and distasteful kind of
Yeah.
kind of feeling, even if it can be viewed as a a socially driven phenomenon in some way.
Especially pathetic because Deuce is purposely engineering circumstances to receive it rather than just, looking for absolution out of, genuine mistakes of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you follow that train of thought, you get to like a deep truth about patriarchy. But that's not what this podcast is about.
It could be.
It couldn't. I'm not prepared. This is just one of those things that like haunts my mind,
Hmm.
and it's popping up here, and it's yeah. No, this is one of those things that I'm not prepared to talk on.
Fair enough. I feel like the gesture you've made in its direction is an indication on.
Hope so.
So after that, we get the segment that Will made a mention of the fact that Deuce is looking for Webb's ghost but can't find it, and so he then has the brief thought of like, well, what if I just kill a bunch more people and maybe that'll make me feel better, and all of that is what leads them to eventually end up in Wall of Death, Missouri, which is as I mentioned already, built around the remains of a carnival. Do we know if it's an anachronism that the Wall of Death, like actual like motorcycle thing, would exist back then? Because I know it's like a modern attraction, but it feels like that would be a recipe for your entire kind of motorcycling troupe to die back in the early 1900s inside a wooden sphere that they're rolling around in.
I mean, Will can definitely speak more to this than I can, but just off the top of my head, it seems possible. I don't see, I mean, I guess maybe with like, I don't have any experience. I have very little experience with seeing this in person, but maybe with like the metal and the type of metal they use that they go around on and stuff. I don't know, but I don't see why it couldn't be possible. I mean, I assume that motorcycles and that the engines maybe wouldn't have been powerful enough back then. Maybe not. I mean, I don't know. It does seem possible to. It's a thing where they like go upside down and stuff, right?
Yeah, that's
All that stuff, and they do patterns and all that.
yeah.
Yeah, it seems possible. I don't know though. I don't know for sure.
I don't think it. I mean, it's the kind of thing where I think it might have been possible for people to have motorcycles with that function. I don't know that it would have been possible for there to be enough people with that level of engineering expertise, right? Because like this is the time period where if you have an automobile, you are building it yourself to a large extent.
Sure.
And sure, you can probably like I'm sure that there were some hints of biker gangs starting, something similar to biker gangs starting back then. I don't know if you're getting enough people who are that dedicated together. And I don't I don't know anything about the history of motorsports really, but quick Google and Wikipedia check gives me that like the first carnival motordrome appeared at Coney Island Amusement Park in 1911. So it's totally possible. Whether it's historically true, probably not.
Sure.
But it is the hippodrome thing. Though.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is the same thing. Just
It's
people.
yeah, it's crazy. And if you have no idea what this looks like, this is a veiled just excuse to recommend this movie, but you can see it in action in the beginning of the film The Place Beyond the Pines, which is an excellent movie that I would recommend everyone watch, whether they've seen a hippodrome in action or not. But it's pretty nutty to watch happen. You could not. I don't think there's an amount of money you could pay me to try and attempt something like that.
That movie has probably my favorite Ryan Gosling performance, probably my favorite Eva Mendes performance, and
Yeah,
also probably my favorite Bradley Cooper performance.
yeah.
All
My favorite
three.
Dane DeHaan performance as well.
Yeah, I do love that movie a lot. I mean, I'm from upstate New York, so I would,
Yeah.
but I do love that movie a lot.
Yeah, that film is excellent. As they show up in Wall of Death, Missouri, it turns out that they are waiting for a new sheriff's deputy, and so they assume that is Deuce, and Deuce is willing to go along with the ruse. Luke, you said you had something that you wanted to talk about with him becoming a police officer.
Yeah, I don't have too much to talk about. It's just that there's two guys I know who I knew before they were police officers and who are still police officers. One of them I haven't talked to in a long time, just because I saw him at a wedding a few years ago, I guess, and we were cordial. But both of them, that one I knew in college, the other one I knew in high school. Both of them were like pranksters. One of them like got in trouble as a teenager, some for like driving around with some of our mutual friends, like shooting BB guns at cars. which can be pretty dangerous to be shooting
Fair.
BB guns at cars. And just doing, like he was known for just kind of, at least from like the age of like 15 to maybe 19, 20, he was just kind of known for being a prankster. The other one was a bit of a prankster too. And that's just kind of it. I do find it interesting. I mean, I wouldn't call either of those guys bad men for various reasons, but it's just kind of interesting that the kind of people that become cops are often the people that, not often, but I mean maybe often, sometimes are the people that like, especially when they were teenagers. I think that struggled with running or being on the wrong side of the law and stuff. Like there's a good amount of cops that I think had at least some experience with doing illegal stuff, like maybe somewhat innocent illegal stuff. But I think you know what I'm saying. Like there's a certain type of guy who becomes a cop, but wasn't always super on the straight and narrow. Not that cops generally are on the straight and narrow, but anyway.
Sure. Yeah, and that same kind of dynamic you're pointing at is one of the reasons I mentioned Deadwood earlier. It's not in the previous chapter, even though I think it's more relevant in the previous chapter. But like that is the character of Seth Bullock in a very direct sense. The Timothy Oliphant character. He is a man in the same way that Webb was trying to, in the inverted way that Frank thinks about it, trying to protect his family by blowing up bridges. Deuce is doing the same kind of mental gymnastics to justify, his continued lack of real moral accountability, I guess. And it's that by saying I can take up the mantle of stopping this, of preventing someone else from doing these same things that I've done. You might, in some sense, be doing it altruistically, or even genuinely be doing it altruistically, although it doesn't seem like that for Deuce. But you are still engaging with the world as an oppositional force to yourself. You're still saying, "I am separate, and I will intervene to change the world, to make it the way that I see fit." And I think that that's not to demean anyone, because I am not like I in a better world I would probably be working in law enforcement or policing in some sense, but we don't live in that world, so fuck that. It's kind of an idiot's idea of doing the right thing.
Yeah, very true. And I think it's important to know too that this is like there is historical precedent for this stretching back to the time contemporary with the book, where Bob Meldrum, as we talked about a while ago, he was an actual sheriff's deputy. There was a number of outlaws or criminals or ne'er do wells that did step inside this career. It is not out of place historically then or now. To get back to where we started with Luke's comment, for something like this to happen, it happens very often.
Yeah, and just to draw it back to Warlock once again, the like if there's a single main character of that book, it is a guy who looks at the world around him, realizes he's been on the wrong side of things, and decides to become the sheriff.
Interesting. Yeah, I really need to read Warlock. I have not, and every month that goes by, I feel somewhat ashamed of that to an even greater degree.
I mean, I think it's a book that was probably very important when it came out and may not be so important now to read, but it's really good. So
Yeah. So then we get into kind of what his life as a sheriff's deputy looks like in this town, and it's mostly taking care of what they call chores. I find this paragraph really funny. But it was not the minutia of the day's offenses: the penises caught experimentally in laundry wringers, repeated thefts of the only automobile in town, willing victims of the formulations of Happy Jack LaFoam, the local pharmacist who'd have to be rescued from up telegraph poles and belfries, from temperance meetings, or the unsympathetic weaponry of spouses in pursuit. Not the fabric of the municipal day Deuce was really there to attend. He discovered so much is beyond call around the clock for the more abstract emergency. The prophecy which loomed out beyond the sensible horizon of daybook fact, the unspoken of thing they'd hired him to deal with, which he came to fear could only be regarded like you'd need a telescope to look at another planet, by way of the police ticker or printing telegraph in the back of the sheriff station. Specialist apparatus, the next step on into the 20th century from wanted men's faces on penny postals. I love that because it showcases both what he's actually dealing with in this town, which is like, their chores. It's really not much to actually take care of from a legal precedent, but they have this guy here who is a trained killer in a lot of ways in case there's something else, because this is still the old west in a way, even though we're in close to the 1910s, and they don't know what's coming around the bend. It's again really good writing and really effective at explaining to the reader in a very simplistic way what this environment is like. It makes perfect sense based upon what he's doing with his time, what kind of place it is that he's found himself employed in.
I do find especially the phrase abstract emergency, it does definitely remind me of terrorism. I do
Sure.
think you could call terrorism, the threat of terrorism, an abstract emergency in a lot of ways, both in terms of like, it's like, like the whole, like, I could be a victim of terrorism, but then like anybody could, but then, you know what I'm saying? Where it's like kind of abstract, It's hanging over you. It's very, very rarely real for people. I mean, terrorist attacks are often largely symbolic, I would say, just in terms of like, if we're talking like number of deaths in terms of like war, they're usually pretty minuscule as opposed to civilian and soldier deaths in war, but they have this like outsized effect on society.
Well,
Which
yeah, I mean,
I do think is in there. Like, and I do think that kind of goes back to this book's social commentary.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the definition of terrorism is like violence in order to achieve like a political point or something like that.
It's specifically the threat of mass casualty or mass political violence for the sake of pushing the government to capitulate.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have to be pedantic about this. Terrorism means something.
I appreciate. No, I appreciate you being pedantic
Not, not,
about it.
not at
It
you,
does mean
not at the
something.
world.
Yeah. I mean, the word terrorist in the modern day has gotten a little muddled, let's say.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And like, what is Pynchon's phrase from his original description of the book? Like, no similarity between modern events is intended, or something like that. Like, there is something you could read in there, Luke, about like them hiring this like big bad guy to watch out for the abstract, threat, having something to do with the way in which we, gave ourselves over to the big bad guy of the security state and of Homeland Security and all of that in order to ostensibly protect us from the abstract threat of Islamic terrorism. So I think that makes sense. I think that's absolutely probably in there.
Well, and I also think it does kind of remind me of, I mean, I guess there hasn't been a war on American soil in such a long time, but like wars in general are kind of an abstract emergency in the Western world for the last, I mean, in the Western world for the last like 70 years, but in America specifically for like over 100 years, I would say, or like, I think you get what I'm saying. With like, it's not like American citizens at home were being generally threatened. I mean, you can say that, with terrorism that everyday Americans, have been victims of that. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, two kind of angles on that. First of all, just kind of proving your point about. I don't think it needs to be proven, but it's a nice anecdote. Doesn't necessarily need to go on the show, but basically, a friend of mine just the other day shared a little story about how he was in the elevator, and for some reason, he made some. I don't know exactly the context. I'm sure it was somewhat relevant. He made some statement along the lines of like the 20th century was easily the worst humanity had ever been. And I think there's an argument about that, but he's got a point. Um, but the person he was talking to immediately kind of like hushed and said, "But what about 9/11?" When you know, no, I'm sorry, 9/11 was like a couple tens of thousands of people died. Pretty horrible in aggregate. Not millions,
Right. Yeah.
not millions of deaths. In any case, and the deeper point about this, I think something about the abstract emergency, and by something I mean it feels kind of on the nose to me. I don't know if it is intended. My brain has just been talking to me about this for a lot lately. There's a political theorist who was essentially a proto-Nazi and one of the major academics justifying National Socialist political action prior to them just going full totalitarian, named Carl Schmitt, who basically talks about this idea of borders and any kind of division in a population that is governed by, as he would have talked about it, and I think it's fair to talk about, a liberal nation state, will tend to be utilized by the most reactionary elements for the sake of driving whatever they want out of the political situation at the time. A good example would be fentanyl coming over the Mexican border in the US right now. Now, anyone who knows anything understands that most fentanyl is not coming over the Mexican border. Most fentanyl is being shipped in. However, it happens. And as has recently become quite big news in New Mexico, the DEA is often culpable for allowing it to go through just through petty bribery and corruption.
Hmm.
And yet the fentanyl coming over the border is seen as an explicit reason to fund ICE. It's seen as a reason to crack down on immigration, when immigration has nothing to do with fentanyl. Literally nothing. There is no way to draw those two lines except that Mexico's involved. And yet it's a reason, even though the people who are in charge of the border, the people who are in charge of policing drug trafficking, are also the people who are letting it happen. It's used as a pretext to do anything, essentially. And we saw that in the wake of 9/11, where, oh, well, someone could steal a plane and fly it into buildings. So why not pass legislation that allows an entire surveillance apparatus to be put in place that 25 years later now tracks literally every American everywhere and most of the world's citizens.
Right. Yeah.
And he talked about that as the state of emergency, and the abstract crisis is a pretty direct translation of his ideas.
Yeah. I would agree completely. So then we get into another one of these like moments of just really, really effective writing, where one day across the ticker tape shows up the report that his longtime partner is dead, has been shot by an unknown assailant, and the assailant has not been seen since the shooting. And he assumes that it is the company finally just caught up with his pal, and he has this sort of big kind of moment of grief that comes out of him that is written in incredibly effectively. Does somebody want to read the paragraph with Deuce's eyes are filling unexpectedly with salt water on 478?
Deuce's eyes were filling unexpectedly with salt water, some outrush of emotion trapped, prickling just behind his nose, as he imagined himself on out to some picturesquely windswept grave, head bowed, hat off. Big, slow lummox couldn't get out your own way. They were bound to find you. Shouldn't have even been you. You were just along for the job, covering your partner's back, maybe deserving of hard labor, but not be shot down in some cantina surrounded by language you never learned more of than Senorita Chinga Chinga and Mas Cerveza. Maybe, you old fool. Damn slow. What'd you think you were doing? While creeping into him came the rectal message that somebody might be more than willing to do him up too, along with a quickening heartbeat of hatred, a co-conscious witness of all their past together violated, and death's sovereign barbed wire run straight through. Deuce needed to be the fuck out of his office. Out the door, saddled up and raising dust, finding and gut shooting a sumbitch killed his running mate again and again till there's more shit on the walls than blood. Lake arrived in the middle of these reflections with a couple armloads of laundry full of sunlight, smelling like the first day of the world. The frail suggestion that none of this needed to come to pass. What is it now, my own guardian of the law?
So what do we think of Deuce's reaction here? Obviously, what happens is he tells her that she's dead, and then she in an effort to kind of soften the blow says, well, he was always gonna find trouble in some way or another, and then that just sort of causes him to react in leaving out on his own to go try and hunt down the killer. But what do we think of Deuce's grief?
I did want to go back a little bit with the ticker tape stuff. It does occur to me that because it says that I think it's maybe even implied that part of his job is just to sit there and watch the ticker tape thing, and that does remind me at least somewhat of like I think a ticker tape thing like that would have been something like a 24-hour like news channel in some ways. I mean, specifically about crime, obviously, but it does kind of strike me, and that kind of goes back to the social commentary of this book, just because 24-hour news channels were not so much a thing before 9/11, or I mean they kind of were, but it wasn't as big of a thing in people's lives. And maybe I mean I haven't seen Eddington that many times, but maybe that movie is stuck in my brain to the point where I just assume that cops probably sit around watching Fox News a lot. But so I do think that maybe is in there. There's some language in there that just kind of reminds me of that. But there's something just really like his summary of the way Sloat died. I've spent time in foreign countries where I knew little to nothing, or little to know of the language, and or didn't know anyone there. I've traveled on my own a little bit and stuff like that, where I'm sure Deuce is. I mean, I guess yeah, because we start off this, or is it? Where is the discussion of Deuce feeling like he is alone or never is alone? Is that it's Deuce that has that thing, right? That thought.
Yeah, one sec.
Is it? And I don't know if we skipped
It's
over it or if it's to
474.
come. Oh, 474.
Yeah, right at the like.
Though,
break.
yeah, the other section break, yeah. So I do find that interesting. Like the just it's because like the surrounded by language you never learn much more of than Senorita Chinga Chinga and Mas Cerveza. Maybe you old fool. That's just so tragic to me. The way he summarizes it. I mean, objectively, fuck Slow and also Deuce, but like I don't like either of them, and they Slow deserved what he got, and I kind of hope. I don't. I mean, I forget what happens with Deuce in this book. I mean, but I do. The first time I read this book, and I do wish that, and I still wish that Deuce gets what's coming to him. But the way he thinks about it, the way he summarizes it, just makes me sad. And the way he feels like, shouldn't even have been you. You were just along for the job, covering your partner's back. Deuce obviously feels at least somewhat responsible for his friend's death. I think there might be an element of, I should like that he should have been there to help him, to watch his back, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, and then whenever he's talking to Lake, he's like kind of an asshole right off the bat, which, that'll Slow dying would obviously be such a complicated event in a relationship like theirs. Even barring, the fact that they were a throuple for a while, like just the fact that he helped Deuce kill Lake's father, if it was just that, it still would be a very complicated death for that relationship to withstand and to deal with.
Yeah, he's kind of conveniently situated him to be the natural, like as a sheriff. I mean, sheriff's deputy. He's kind of positioned to naturally retreat into that very wounded reaction, rather than and not necessarily to say that he is the kind of person who has the capacity to sit there and maybe not stew, but process his survivor's guilt. But he is in a position where he spends all day reading on the ticker about how this strike, so, some company trying to break a strike led to a small riot, or how this or that anarchist did this or that thing. And hey, he's the sheriff. He's in charge of making the law work. And the anarchists want to get rid of the law. So, hey, damn them. And it's just something that gives him an excuse to disconnect further from that more, again, that accountability that he is starting to develop the ability to engage with.
I do think that there's also an element of or kind of what you're saying, but it's like Deuce is like pretending like Sloat doesn't deserve to die or didn't deserve retribution, didn't deserve revenge to be had upon him, and that's a very, cops always think that like they don't do anything wrong, that their negative reputation in some circles is undeserved. Nothing's ever their fault, at least in America. And that I keep bringing this shit up, I guess, but I'm just going to bring it up again. I mean, it does, like, people do like to act like 9/11 was this like thunder, like lightning out of the blue, like there wasn't a lead up to it, like American aggression overseas and in the Middle East and in Arabic countries hasn't been an issue, hasn't been like a negative. They would like we've been a negative influence on the world and on that area of the world, for a long time now. And it's people like to think that, like, we didn't I'm not saying we deserve 9/11 or not, but there was a lead up to it, and it wasn't even on their side. Like, there was, I think there was like terrorist attack, like a USS Cole, I believe, in the 90s. I think somebody tried to bomb the World Trade Center, I think, like a decade before the airplanes hit it. I want to say around that time, maybe more like 5 years.
Osama bin Laden did, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, there's all types of, stuff that I could get into with that, but it's always just this whole like, oh, like Sloat didn't deserve it. Well, like objectively, Sloat did deserve it, and that's just kind of how cops are and how authority figures can be.
So he runs off to investigate and see if he can find who's responsible for Sloat's death. And while he's gone, we get the first of a couple of different conversations with Tace Boylster, who's the sheriff's wife. And this is where kind of, for the first time, Lake sort of unburdens herself to another person, complete from beginning to end. And there's getting into kind of some of the stuff that you were talking about, Will, but turn on its head a little bit. There's this quotation that I really like from the end of 479 into 480, where it says, "Batman kicked me out of the house, just left me. I could have ended up in some crib in Mexico or dead for all he cared. Should have been me that killed him. And it turned out to be Deuce. And then later on, the two of you met up. Well, ain't exactly like you planned it out together, is it? Still, bad enough. Pa's dead and gone, and I haven't stopped hating him. What unnatural daughters that make me? A girl's supposed to love her father." "Sure," said Tace. "In those Elsie Dinsmore stories or someplace, we all grew up on that stuff and it poisoned our souls." She put her cigarette in her mouth and reached a hand gravely to rest on Lake's. "Tell me something." So there is this absolute acknowledgement of this kind of expectation of forgiveness, or I forgot the exact word you were using, but this like angelic figure that women are supposed to have. Because in that loving of her father, it would have required that forgiveness and that, like, wiping away of the sort of debt between the two of them, even though it really should not have been hers to try and bring restitution to. That should have been Webb's. So that is still certainly working away within her. And then, of course, that plays out a little bit in the dynamic that the two of them have. Do we have any thoughts about this conversation before we get into her dream that she has?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good kind of it's continuing, I guess, weirdly, what Luke was kind of getting at with the with specifically, so okay, it's kind of like it's kind of like almost it's just kind of an extension of what you were saying, Luke, about Sloat deserving to die. I think that, on a philosophical level, I've got issues with how you said it, but I don't think you're like, I get what you mean, and I don't disagree. And I like there are. It's one of those things where that's kind of the inversion of Maeva's learning of maturity. Here we have a woman who it's almost explicitly stated some awful things happened to in her childhood. And she hears Lake's story, and sure, awful things happened to Lake's childhood. And it's not about saying, oh, but she didn't have it that bad. It's saying the pain she had was the kind of thing that, yes, it's not her fault. She didn't deserve to feel the need to make up with her father. And she doesn't deserve to have this hanging over her head in such a direct way. And all of that. And just to clarify for any listeners who don't, you don't know me as well as the other as the co-hosts of the show do, when I say that, in a slightly different world, she would have grown to forgive Webb, it's not coming from the standpoint of she should have done it or like that's what is the right thing to do or in a better world that would have happened. It's just that the culture that all of them were raised in, and to some extent we all live in now, is like this zombie culture where we pretend that things just kind of work out because you have to put up with each other, and eventually that day by day settling scores evens out. And it can't happen when you have this kind of fragmentation of society. But you have Tace as this kind of emblem of someone who is similarly positioned as Maeva in the broadest of sense, but has chosen to harden her heart rather than look for peace. And it's tragic, honestly, in a way that I feel much more intensely than Deuce's tragedy. But it's a lot.
Agreed. All right, so then we get into a dream about Maeva, where she first shows up as a woman, or as her mother speaking to an animal, which was a regular kind of motif of her waking life back when they all lived in the same home. And eventually, essentially, they reach a confrontation where Maeva is trying to speak to her mom, is trying to create that reconciliation, and it's just not there. What do we interpret this dream as?
I do think at least partially, I mean, it's obviously based on memory.
Right.
So it is kind of a flashback. I mean, I'll get to why this is important pretty quickly, but it'll probably come across as kind of odd initially. I mean, I do think that you can kind of, like with cats and dogs specifically, they become domesticated to the point, as a species, they become domesticated to the point where you can kind of tell what they're trying to communicate when they vocally make sounds.
Sure.
A lot of the time, it's not, I think saying that, like you can't obviously tell like exactly what they're saying, but you can kind of figure out, what they're trying to say a lot of times. I mean, from personal experience, it's often just, if you know them or whatever, it's often just, I want food, motherfucker. But with this kind of like dream, who knows if, I mean, I do think that Maeva probably did think that she could have exchanges with squirrels and birds, because it is a little like more like dream logic ish to not just like, instead of cats and dogs, make it like non-domesticated animals and like hawks and stuff like that. Or who knows if Maeva in real life really thought that she could communicate with hawks or whatever. I do think that I mean, it is stated that she would do this. That was always Maeva who would get into these exchanges with animals, nearly conversations. But I do think that in this dream it might be a more like kind of stylized version of that of Maeva's true self. I mean, obviously it's a dream, but I do really like. I mean, I would have been kind of pinch on as to just kind of not state that she was dreaming at the beginning, but I do like that he makes it clear, because the jump from she dreamed about Maeva to squirrel on a fence post period is pretty fun, and that just kind of immediately get a different kind of, like, I think it's syntax is the word I'm looking for, but it's a different kind of like sentence structure. Things are a little bit more choppy. These are like, we're in a dream and the language is matching that we're in a dream very quickly, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
As far as like what it means for Lake or Mava, I mean, it would be more what it would mean for Lake. I do think it's kind of the you do your best. She cried out at her mother to wreck us, and then you run away out of reach behind the wall of death. There could be like a kind of dream displacement of she maybe would like want to say that to Webb. It doesn't really, like maybe it's not dead. I mean, Lake maybe thinks of her as in some ways dead, just because I assume that Lake assumes that she's never going to see Mava again. So in a way, she is dead to her. But Webb is literally dead, and I do think there is a kind of a dream displacement there. And I just really love the language in this kind of short section in general. It's just really fun to picture. It's a little bit cartoonish in a nice way. It's a little bit kind of surreal in a nice way. I really like this section.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me it read more of like maybe not more. I don't think these are contradictory ideas, but it's like something about the I read the death as more of a metaphor for past, right? The way
Yeah.
that things can't be undone. But I mean, like I said, I don't think those are contradictory at all. But it's almost like she's personifying her. I mean, okay, so this is like just, 101 level literary analysis, mothers in nature and shit. Lake is often identified as like the symbol for nature, but of course she is going to have her own symbols of nature, and of course Mother Nature is an old symbol. And in a way, it's almost like she is trying to talk with all of her past as personified in her mother, and it's being like dredged through layers of like twisting metaphor because dream logic into like the words of news being brought by spare animals. And it's almost like getting at something about how like we are alienated from the past just through time, and how we are also alienated from each other because of those decisions that are made due to the context of the time that has now passed. It's roughly what I got.
Agreed. I feel like basically you and I have the same interpretation. I feel like that is a big theme of these two chapters together. In a lot of ways, I feel like these two chapters are analyzing the different ways in which, you know, there is a division of the past, in meaning the stuff that we have already read essentially in the book, in terms of all these characters' lives, and where they're at now, and how those two things cannot come back in sort of communion with one another. It's the passing away of the old world in preparation for the newer, unfortunately for these characters, sort of darker one. And I think that beginning the first chapter in this section with the sort of renewal of the town itself and the kind of description of the house being destroyed is a really great overarching image to look at as we then kind of zoom into the different relations that moved in and out of that house. So of course from here Deuce does return, and you know he he did not find his friend's killer as obvious, but it is clear that there is a ghost of Sloat running around, and the two of them are trying to communicate about something with one another, to the point where Deuce is no longer able to really sleep at night. The joke of person can't get no damn sleep around here is very funny. It made me laugh. And then we are treated to another conversation with Tace Boylster, where Lake rather is trying to find again some way to absolve Deuce, or some way to kind of see a brighter possible future here. She uses the phrase like, uh, he can change. She's going to be the angel of mercy to fix him, she believes. And there's a better guy in him somewhere. A lot of talk about that. And then eventually it gets into her trying to, again, absolve him in the way that we talked about at the top of our discussion of this chapter of maybe there was another gun involved. Maybe there's greater context for why he shot him. There's a lot of bargaining. There's a lot of attempts at sort of acceptance or kind of coping that happens in this conversation, all before it leads Lake to realize that there's not much she can do, that she's in a position where it feels like she can't leave him for a number of different reasons, before she kind of fantasizes about what her life could have been if the two of them had not ended up getting together. And this is just another case of like there is a lot of tragedy in a very realistic way, I guess is the way that I would put it, in these chapters. All of the things that they're dealing with between Frank and Maeva, and then here with Lake in particular, is stuff that people wrestle with a lot in day-to-day life. I would imagine just as much back then as we do now. This stuff is kind of eternally relevant, of whether it's being with the wrong partner, or trying to make excuses for someone else's behavior, or trying to find a way to reconcile the way you feel with like the actual reality of your life situation. This is all just really, I've said it so many times, so I'm so sorry for the audience who's really probably annoyed with this phrase by now, but it's really effective writing. It's really effective writing of these characters and the situation that they find themselves in, and the kind of bargaining or coping that you try to engage in order to find a better way through these complicated sort of relationships that you find yourself feeling stuck in. And I stand by my earlier comments about how like the threesome angle of their relationship between Sloat, Deuce, and Lake is not, I think, necessary. And it comes up in a section, a brief like mention that I skipped just because it's not relevant to me anyway, that the ghost is fucking her in her sleep. But like all of that I still think is unnecessary. But I do appreciate how Pynchon has taken one of his motifs, this concept of kind of the woman acting in an unfaithful manner to something, a political movement, an ideal, her personal morals, or in this case, going after her father's killer as kind of a requisite thumbing the nose at your parents thing, but exploring it in such depth in a way in which the nuances and eccentricities of this relationship would actually play out if it was happening in real life. This disconnect that they have now that this kind of murder has been acknowledged, and they're trying to deal with the fallout of that in any way that they possibly can. It feels very earnest and true in a way that is not easy to capture, I don't think. And I appreciate that the character basically spends the last 10 pages of this section we're reading for this episode wrestling with the reality of that in any number of ways. It really strikes me as Pynchon kind of at his best in terms of his relational writing, which we've mentioned many times is often what people sort of point out as a weakness in what he does, but it certainly is not here.
Yeah, I think it's a very accurate, in a lot of ways. This part is, I mean, the parts with Taste, at least, I find very relatable and accurate. I mean, it is a very good and enjoyable somehow depiction of a toxic relationship. There's one phrase I wanted to highlight that kind of relates to that. This lost, it's on 483, kind of the middle of the page, in the middle of the sentence. This lost trail back to what should have been unsoiled memories, which just kind of speaks to the way that like trauma can retroactively either like coming to terms with trauma in the past, or a fresh trauma or a fresher trauma can kind of color memories, and even like places and different stuff like that are things that would awaken those memories, which I do think is kind of what she's getting at. And there's also, I mean, from my own experiences with unhealthy relationships, let's say, I mean, there's usually a reason. I mean, there's almost always a reason that that people get stuck in these relationships. And from my own experiences, it's at least partially because at the beginning of the relationship, either either like there's always a honeymoon period is what I'm getting at. But what follows the honeymoon period can make the honeymoon period seem kind of sinister in retrospect, I guess, sometimes. Where it's you can kind of be like, oh, you were like, and obviously, from like you can kind of go back and be like, oh, this person was hiding things, or they're hiding who they truly are. And Deuce, I don't. I'm pretty sure that when Lake first met Deuce, at least she didn't. I think we've established that she didn't know who he was, right? Or did she? I can't remember. I feel like it's that she didn't know exactly who he was, at least.
Yeah, she didn't know who he was. I had a conspiracy corner that I stand by, that I think there was a moment of recognition through the event. But yeah, she certainly was not conscious of it. She didn't know the guy's name.
Yeah, and I'm like I've seen scientific studies have talked about recent scientific studies in the last few years have talked about how like your opinion of somebody is often formed within like the first like second that you see them, I guess. I don't know how true that really is from my own experiences, but according to this scientific study, like you look at somebody and then you kind of immediately establish your opinion of them or the general outline of your opinion of them, and that general outline doesn't usually change that much is what that scientific study was trying to establish, I think. Obviously that's a bit nebulous and probably hard to actually define in scientific terms and everything, but I do remember reading about that. Yeah, I don't the writing the writing here is there's so much. I mean, even just the diary section, like there's missing commas and stuff like that to where like it's very I feel like there's at least one missing comma and stuff where I feel like that's intentional. Or like the way it's just very like she writes like how she talks and like it's very believable. And for a writer that almost is pretty much always almost always writing in third, it does. I do wish that he would write a whole novel in first person. I think that's a pipe dream, and whatever. But I do think it would be very interesting to see what that would come out like.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. But the overall kind of scene, I guess, what I don't know, what I kind of really like about it is that y when you're trying to depict an unhealthy romantic relationship, and especially one where there is like true bad blood, it's really it's really incredibly rare for someone to be able to not romanticize the feelings, because and this is one of those things where like we have horrible language around this. Like we have this meme that like uh, an abuser didn't love you because X, Y, or Z. And sure, they might not have. And if you're someone who was a victim of abuse, that's probably the healthiest way for you to cope with it. But like it's much more fucked up than that. It's it's usually something along the lines of that diary section. Usually it is people like and Luke, thank you for mentioning the honeymoon period, but I think it's even simpler. I think it's as simple as like I liked this person. I can't
Yeah.
have liked this person who is so horrible to me. And like on a fundamental level, like when you're talking about like trauma rewriting your memories or how you felt about things, I mean, I think that even like romanticizes it a little too much. It's like you are just trying to reallocate your internal sense of meaning so that you don't have to blow everything up. And I think it's such an incredible depiction of that, because we don't see at this point in their relationship, we don't see it very soon after, but we don't see Deuce being actively hurtful to Lake. He is genuinely trying to correct his behavior, and that doesn't help anything. The trust has been broken. He did this horrible thing, and he and she has to deal with who he is and was, and she can't deal with the fact that she likes this guy at all. and that he did these things. And it's grim and it's heavy and it's not romantic. But if you've ever been in that scenario, that's what it feels like, almost horribly. It feels like the 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 thing of your mind, of your life, is falling apart until you come up with a way to justify yourself. And thankfully for Lake, she kind of takes it in a slightly more productive direction, I guess, in within this chapter. But it is just horrible, and it's not horrible because it's like this person who is bleeding themselves dry trying to help this person. That's just the excuse she gives. She's just bleeding out, and so is he.
Well, could not have said it better myself.
Thank you.
Do we have anything else we want to add on that section before we get into their desire to have kids?
I do like the return of her wish to have been a carefree saloon girl.
Yeah,
It's not like some deep thing. It just makes sense and it's nice.
especially because that was sort of her last, I guess, moment of free will in a certain way prior to all of this. Maybe not free will, but that was kind of the moment of her determination, or the direction of her determination prior to all of this happening. So it's also, again, yearning for that prior life.
Yeah, I think it's even like called loss of innocence at some point in this chapter.
Yeah, I think you're right. So now that Deuce is back, it is revealed to us that they are deciding now to really kind of push to have a kid. And it starts out seeming to be fairly, like, innocuous a little bit, and then it is revealed that the whole reason for this is to find some way to kind of, as I don't remember which one of you said it, but find some sort of way to undo or find some sort of absolution for murdering Webb. And that somehow, if they manage to have this child, that it will make that finally okay in Deuce's mind, that somehow he will have repaid one life with another, essentially. And there's this moment within all of this stuff regarding the child that I really love. Does someone want to read the quote on 484 that starts with what the really strange thing was and heads to the end of the paragraph?
The really strange thing was that with all there was to send them off down forever separate tracks, he continued to desire her as much, no, more than ever now. And she finally started paying attention as she felt it turn into power for her, flowing out of the invisible unknowability of men like bank interests into some account in her name she hadn't known was there, growing with the days. She learned how easily she could ignore his heated eyes across the room, slide away from his hands, choose her own moments, and try not to smirk too much at how grateful he was, and not be assaulted for any of it, nor even screamed at. What was not so clear was if and when he'd wake from this obviously short-term opium dream, or how far it might be safe to push before he did wake up, maybe even too quickly for her to get to a safe distance away. Skillful stepping, at least a sensitive touch, would be needed. She could not afford to relax when any unguarded word, eye movement, routine flash of jealousy might trip the latch and send him back to good old Deuce, blind crazy out of the chute and looking for blood at long last.
So I love that particular quote because I think it shows how this dynamic is shifting as the kind of relationship or guilt or kind of almost grief process between the two of them is shifting. And I love the acknowledgement on Pynchon's part, if we're going to continue to just talk about how good of a writer he is, because that's really what these two chapters are illustrating, of Lake seeing how his desperation, how his obsession with her forgiveness, how his kind of need for absolution actually turns into into power that she is able to wield, and that she's comfortable doing so, that she's able to find a way to kind of give herself some degree of liberation in this circumstance by being able to feed into that power imbalance. But I think the other part of this that is so great from a perspective of depicting an abusive relationship, which to use Will's phrase, if you've ever been in that situation or that dynamic, you'll recognize this, of the fact that these things can go sideways at any time. You know, the thing that another aspect that can kind of keep people in abusive relationships for a long time is this like memory of when things were good, and this kind of hope that it is going to turn back to being that way in the future, and that if you can just kind of ride out the negative parts, eventually it'll get good again. But the longer you are in one of these relationships, the more that turns into fear of the bad parts, of the kind of up and down nature of these relationships. And that's really what's articulated here. That, like, in their present dynamic, when things are good, she is somewhat empowered by the imbalance between the two of them, with his kind of obsession with his need for his need of absolution from her. But if she, doesn't go about this in the most intelligent way possible, the craftiest way possible, some might say, it can lead to all of this getting tumbled down. And so it's this very precarious nature by which something seems to be improving, but in the way that abusive relationships do, there's a downside like right around the corner that you can run into. And it's never stated explicitly. None of this stuff is stated explicitly. It's all stated very kind of subtly. But especially if you've been in these dynamics before, which I unfortunately suspect that maybe Pynchon has, based upon the deftness with which he writes about it, or at the very least was able to talk to people who had. This rings very true. This rings very true in a way that is difficult to read if you have any personal experience with it, especially being the one woman on the show, speaking from an experience like what Lake had. It is very accurate to like the relationship with my first serious girlfriend. So it really rings very true in a way that I was impressed by, and again, and impressed with his ability in this book in particular at writing these characters and these relationship dynamics.
Really, it's one of those things, belaboring the point, but it is, Pynchon being Pynchon. The way he does that is almost in the same way that he, like, he'll take something from, the personal scale to the global scale, or from, one subject to another. But in this case, he's just doing it about, like, what a psychologist would label as splitting. Like, he's just kind of just demonstrating how one may think in a way that is simultaneously impossible, but is extremely emotionally satisfying and is addictive.
Yeah. Do we have any thoughts on like the attempts for them to have a kid beyond just what's on the page? It strikes me as fairly just, it is what it is, but if you guys have anything you want to add, I'd love to hear it.
I do want to point out that I just really love the first paragraph in that after the section break. After what had added up to years of dodging, false uttering, and hard writing to escape it, Deuce was relentlessly being delivered into his own life, and what a dismal prospect it was turning out to be. I don't really want to be too melodramatic, but there have been times in my life when I've felt like that. I feel like where I'd spent all this time kind of trying to escape the reality of my life, and then all of a sudden the reality of it just kind of suddenly sets in, if that makes sense. This has happened a few times in my life, at the age of 36, in my adult life at least. Not so much whenever I was younger, I guess. I do think it's part of growing up is that is an aspect of what Pynchon's getting out with that paragraph. I forget the exact quote being like, it's, like wherever you go, like, you always have to deal with yourself. You can't really escape yourself no matter how hard you try. And Deuce is dealing with the reality. I get that also kind of leads into the power dynamic depicted in the power imbalance, as you all said in the previous section, where I think Deuce is kind of coming to terms with the fact that, like he has irrevocably wronged Lake in a way that cannot be, as like it's irrevocable, like it cannot be undone symbolically and obviously, or metaphorically, and then obviously literally too. Like the chickens are coming home to roost, I guess you could say. And it's also you could also interpret that as it's not really expounded upon in this section, but earlier in the chapter, Deuce does seem concerned that the people who killed Sloat, who he, rightfully assumes are Lake's brother, one of Lake's brothers, they could be after him next. So he could be, kind of dealing with the reality of the rest of his life. He's going to be looking over his shoulder, whether he's with Lake or not. Specifically about them wanting children, I do find the fact that the quote they spent unreasonable sums on basically on wanting to have children. I don't know how realistic that would have been back then, just because I guess I just don't really know. I mean, I do kind of forget that was kind of the tail end of like the flourishing of quack medicine in this country.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm forgetting that, but it does strike me as a very modern thing to do, to kind of throw money at a problem like not being able to get pregnant. And I don't know how. I'm sure that's probably at least since capitalism's been around, that's probably always been a thing for some people on some form. But they're obviously, I can't imagine Deuce is making all that much money as a small town policeman, and Lake isn't working, I guess. I don't think it's not depicted that she has a job. So they're obviously, they can't be spending that much money, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way I think of kind of bridging those two ideas that you mentioned, Luke, is that like it's specifically Deuce was relentlessly being delivered into his own life. For both of them, to an extent, parenthood is an opportunity at a do-over in both the kind of fucked up way that like a lot of people end up engaging with parenthood, where you're trying to live childhood again or live a second shot at life through your
Or even
children.
just repair your relationship in a lot of ways.
Well, yeah, that's a whole. I was gonna get to that, but yeah, that's there too. But like they have like such a potent degree of that kind of self-loathing that is rooted in wishing to have done better. That like as much as it might not lead to good parenting, it's not morally bankrupt. It's natural. It's maybe not right, but it's not evil. It's not wrong. Really, it's just not really how it works. And it's this kind of on a deeper level too for both of them. Like it becomes this version of version of like in again that very 101 literary analysis kind of thing. A child's birth is a redemption. It it is like this meaningful thing. It is death being renewed, and it's like they have spent so long building this Rube Goldberg. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine of a relationship in terms of abuse going on here, where like all of the individual moral or not moral, but the individual sentiments are generally coming, at least again in this chapter, are starting from places of generally good intent and are bouncing off an unexpected object in a way that over time has solidified into this identity for themselves and for each other, defined in terms of one another and in terms of this lack of the father, this lack of the the healthiness of the relationship kind of in itself, even ignoring the symbolic or the like the I guess like Freudian kind of angle. Like it is this thing that they have both turned into meaning the inverse of their pain. And it's really spooky in that way, I guess. I don't know how else just put it. It is creepy. Because it is, again, it's not evil. But then once, Deuce really connects the dots and says, I think we owe him, then it starts to feel really bad, like really gross, really unpleasant in a way where sure you can take Tace's perspective and say, look, sure, I thought I wanted kids too, but hey, it killed my dreams. But Lake does genuinely seem inclined that way. It does genuinely seem like she is the kind of person who, if she couldn't be a saloon girl having a life of carefree fun, she would like to be a person who has a family around her, even if it's not her whole life. Unfortunately, that's what would happen. But it is like one person who is very bitter for good reason and has this life experience that tells her to say, hey, kids are a mistake, don't be glad for this, don't don't beat yourself up over this, when like Lake is just trying to say, I don't feel bullied by these other people into wanting kids, I just want a kid, even if the just is all of that fucked up stuff I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't add anything else to that. But go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, I don't know if I interpret, and I feel like Taste is not so much saying that it's not worth having kids as so much as it's just not everyone's purpose on Earth or something like that. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to argue too much because I think that is kind of an element of that where it's just like it's not a requirement, I guess. Like I just really like Taste in general in this section too. I mean, this is a little off subject of the children's stuff, but it is, like in the end of the section, her mentioning that she wanted to rob trains. She knew it was her destiny. She used to, she had her friend and they would plan it out. They had a sworn pact. And then Lake, I can't tell if this is naivete on her part or, like Lake asks what happened. And this is something that, like, I don't know, I would say something like this, or shoot somebody a look that was supposed to communicate something like this, which is like, what do you think happened? Like, like I'm standing here in front of you. I'm and from Tace's perspective, she's the wife of a sheriff. I guess it's possible that she could have done that as a younger woman, but, you know, I don't know. I mean, and the way that it's phrased before that is I wanted to rob trains more than wanted. I knew it. I knew it was my destiny. I know it was my destiny, or I still want. I don't know. But there is. I mean, I guess that is kind of just Pace trying to point out that not every dream comes true. That you don't always get what you want and stuff. I mean, it's phrased differently in a much more like kind of cool and wise way. I want to reiterate that I do really like Tace. For whatever reason, I find her very, like I said, realistic and stuff, and just kind of fun to hang out with. And I do like that she does try. I mean, we didn't go over this, but she does try to use humor to kind of deal with her trauma, which is an attractive quality to me in basically any human being.
She's taken, Luke, I'm sorry.
I do picture her as Deirdre O'Connell, which is, I think Deirdre O'Connell, she's in The Leftovers, I want to say, then she's in Eddington. But just kind of an older, like, I assume she's white, but an older white woman who has a kind of world weariness to her.
Well, and I think the other thing too is that, like, if we want to get into sort of literary structure, this portion of the book is called Bilocations, and you have two women who are both married to officers of the law, and both wanted to be something else. One wanted to be, a saloon girl. One wanted to be a bank robber, and both have kind of had that waylaid in no small part by their marriage. So I think that they're meant to be a little bit mirrored of one another. That like in another life, maybe, you know, Lake could have been Tace. So I think that you're not off base in that, in the sense that like there is still something positive in Tace's adult life, her relationship. You know, she clearly, at the very least, doesn't hate her kids, right? Like she has found some purpose out of that. So I think that it is meant to kind of be two inverse images of one another. But I think it does also, to kind of go back to what Will was saying, I think it also makes sense that with all of that simmering in the background that he mentions, that what explodes out of it is this act of violence where like really lets a lot of pent up feelings and, just rage out on Deuce, to the point where she almost kills him with a frying pan, but then sort of in that last moment chooses not to, and instead just chooses to kind of work him over real good with a shovel, leading to that intervention by Tace and the sheriff to kind of break it up. And of course, leading to the end of the chapter where Tace says it like it is, kind of, and just says, have you ever thought about the fact that you may not be any better than he is? Which I can't imagine how hard that is to hear, but it is kind of the final moment in a chapter that is filled with a lot of really effective writing about the dynamics of this relationship, and watching what has very clearly been simmering underneath the relationship for a long time. Watching that explode in this final moment is there is a degree of catharsis to it, and there is a part of you that wishes that she could just go all the way and kill him, and then you have that final moment of vengeance, but she doesn't. And then, of course, the way that she's kind of questioned for not doing so by Tace at the end there begs the question of asking, does it make her just as worse that she's allowing this man to continue living? What exactly is the nature of the type of evil that she may or may not be? It's one of those moments where when I finished this chapter, I kind of just like exhaled heavily. I was just like,
For sure.
whew, and it kind of left me quiet for a while, where I just had to think about it. It's a really excellent way to close out this chapter.
Yeah, and I mean, so I love you mentioned the not duality, but the parallel existence of Tace and Lake. But the I think, like, I want to draw back the duality, the parallel I drew to between Tace and Maeva, and point out that it's kind of a similar opposition between the mother and daughter to Tace, and it's that, like, in the case of Maeva, I don't know if you'd call her a family woman, and I don't know if you would call Lake a family woman if her, like, first 10 years, it seems like, of adulthood weren't entirely defined by this horrible event and the fallout. But she is essentially a family oriented person, and Maeva is the kind of person who, you know, she's always going to choose peace. She's going to choose the way to, sure, it might take extra sacrifice from her, or it might not take extra sacrifice from her. It might just take things not being the way they should be, but she will take the peace that she's offered. And Tace did not do that. Tace does quite the opposite. And so you have this kind of thing where, yeah, like I mentioned, it's a horribly screwed up, like, again, that psychoanalytic reading of why they want a kid. The fact that Deuce puts a name to it sets her off. And, like, she might have escalated to violence anyway, no matter what. But the thing that actually triggers the first time we've seen Lake be an actually, like, aggressive person, not just responding venomously, not just being someone who's a little bit tough because she lives in a frontier town and she's a young woman and she has to deal with jackasses all the time, but, like, actually commits violence and out of anger, is him calling her a child of the storm. Now, of course, you could talk about how, like, again, in the same way that I mentioned way earlier on in this chapter, he's mentioning all these things way too late. He's bringing up all of this stuff way too late for it to matter. Because what he's clearly trying to do is express, like, I am truly sorry, and I am truly someone who is willing to change, but he isn't able to because he is too whatever. And she's not able to or willing to assist him any further. And him bringing up the Child of the Storm thing right there is like this microcosm of all of this like identity crisis that she's had to deal with her whole life, where she just wanted to go have fun. She just wanted to go to a bar and serve some drinks and get flirted with and mock some guys for flirting with her and maybe take some of them up on an offer, because why not? And everyone telling her her whole life that she's fucked up for that is crazy, because it kind of is. But like she's that's what that name is for her. It is that thing that destroyed her whatever love she might have had at some point for her father, or destroyed the sanctity of that love. And it's this thing that is like, it's a curse that she bears with her, this idea that she is this chaotic element, when all we've ever seen her want to do is genuinely just chill. Like,
Right.
maybe
Yeah.
maybe not literally, but going and play cards or hooking up with some people. Not anything chaotic, not anything violent, not anything hurtful in any real way. And so she doesn't use the frying pan, because that's not who she is. And that's her saying, I am me. I can't do this. I'm not going to kill this man who I do love, as fucked up as it might be. And Tace is someone who clearly, wakes up and chooses violence. But also, like, she's someone who, in order to cope, has had to. And so for her, she looks at Lake letting him live and sees an admission that she is as bad. She is as weak-willed as Deuce. She is as willing to compromise everything that matters. Because what matters here is that Deuce did a horrible thing and he deserves to die. And whether you agree with that or not, clearly Lake doesn't think that. Clearly Lake does believe that that's not how people are, even if it weren't like this horribly toxic relationship. I just don't think she would be a murderer if she could avoid it. And I don't know, it's an amazing kind of depiction of that, like, spiraling binary nature of morality in a way, I guess. And it's a long road to get here. And I agree, Kate, with a lot of the reservations that you mentioned. I have been defending them the most on this show, but it's not because I feel that way truly. It's just, I think it deserves to be mentioned.
Mhm.
And it's just that, like, it's not just, but that aside, this is still one of the best depictions I've ever seen of, like, a person struggling to find themselves when they've built their entire life on almost, like, not necessarily built their life on hatred, but um, on like this kind of repressive mentality, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I again couldn't have said it better myself.
I do
Do
find
we?
the
Yeah. Go ahead, Luke.
I have a few different things I want to say. Some of them are a little bit more nebulous, man, than others. But anyway, I do find their conversation after they're kind of done bickering about having children, like the lead up to her hitting him, very interesting. I mean, it really kind of ramps up for me. I mean, she's calling him truly insane, but there's a price to pay for certain, but more likely it's no babies ever. Ain't just me. Something in his voice now warning her to step careful. Which I do think that Deuce is maybe there's two different ways I take that. That in particular I take just maybe one way, in that I do feel like he's maybe feeling for. I think he is implying there that he does not want her to question his manhood as it relates to them being able or not being able to have children. And then he's basically saying that like I'm not the only problem here. I mean, likely medicinally speaking, it's one or the other is just unable to have a child for whatever reason. But he's kind of trying to say that she shouldn't question his manhood, which I do find interesting. I mean, there is stuff earlier in the chapter about or like stuff about like his dick not being big enough to like impregnate her and stuff. Where she apparently said that something like that to him, and I don't know. I mean, him like repeating, telling her some of like her dad's last words, and there is some phrases that I find really interesting that I do find also confusing, but they are very evocative. Especially this sentence: "He was a dead carcass with a jacking hammer in his hand. The high grading me and Sloat just details making it official. You better think about that before you start in on me." I interpreted that as just basically, I didn't really know what to do with the phrase jacking hammer or high grading. I assumed it was them using some type of mining tools to torture Webb. I could be wrong, though. It's just very evocative language and kind of, I can't tell if it's jargon or what's going on, but it's if it is Deuce saying, "Hey, I tortured your dad and he couldn't stop talking about you," it's a very strange way to phrase it and a very interesting way to phrase it as well. And then he does an impression of her dead dad, not just the phrase, but an uncanny impersonation of Webb's voice, "Child of the Storm." I mean, that's just, I don't, Deuce maybe doesn't know. I mean, obviously doesn't know that that's one of the last things, maybe the last thing that Webb said to Lake. But to have the person that killed your dad impersonate your dad's last words to you whenever you left on a bad terms, and he's the person that killed your dad and is the reason you can't ever make whatever was wrong with your dad possibly right. That's some pretty fucked up stuff. It's heavy. If they were actually somehow good people, I mean, good people wouldn't be saying these kind of things to each other. But if they're good people, it would be kind of deeply upsetting. As it stands, they're just both so shitty that it's not as emotionally affecting as it could be. But that's kind of inherent to their relationship. It's not Pynchon's fault, in my opinion. But I don't know. I do. I mean, I do. Taste, whenever she shows up and says, "This has got to stop," she began, then saw it was Deuce down bleeding all over the pattern oilcloth. And then later, she says you can make a case, as Kate kind of went over a little bit, but you can make a case, she said after a while, not at all reluctant, but as if allowing herself a long withheld treat. "You are every bit as bad as your little wedded husband there." And it's never stated by Pynchon that I don't think it's stated, I could be wrong, that Deuce has ever laid hands on Lake. I do find some of that phrasing, like "this has got to stop," would imply to me, and then in her changing tact whenever she realizes that it's Deuce who's been victimized in this particular instance. It implies to me that Deuce has been hitting Lake, but that's never stated. And if somebody were to state that for certain, I would maybe push back on that, but I do think it's at least implied. So that's been going on. And I mean, the "oh shit, Lake, no." I mean, he's basically pleading for his life in some ways. I don't know much about 12-inch frying pans or how much a cast iron frying pan weighs even today. I use a different kind of frying pan or whatever. And I feel like they probably would have been pretty damn heavy back then. And it would have been much more likely, as it's later stated on 487, that I feel like if she'd gone with the cast iron frying pan, a fatality there would have been a little bit more likely, to maybe a lot more likely. But so, it's just,
just to give you the detail.
Yeah.
12-inch frying pan made today is 8 pounds. And I imagine it's probably another, because I have a vintage frying pan. It's about 30 to 50% thicker. So call it 10, 12 pounds.
Yeah, and it's metal too. Like, it's not going to give much if you hit somebody with it. Yeah, I mean, it's all this kind of next level. Whenever I I mean, it is. I don't like in Mason and Dixon. There's also some domestic violence, and in Mason and Dixon, it's the male victimizing the female, I believe. And I do remember thinking that in Mason and Dixon, that whole situation, it's a lot more in depth and longer and more absurd in many different ways. But I do remember having some qualms with just depicting any type of domestic violence in any type of comedic light. That's obviously I mean, in some ways, a very modern thing to like go back and be like, people in the 1700s should have acted different and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I don't know. I do really like this whole thing. And I do like that, I mean, say Lake had just woken up one day and chosen violence for no reason, it would be understandable. But I do like the ramping up. You are kind of, I do remember being kind of glued to the page a little bit in terms of where is this going, like in a good way, like me anticipating, like there's a sense of rising to a climax that is very pleasant, or not pleasant, but just like fun to read, and engaging and intriguing. Yeah. And I mean, the whole thing that, she's as bad as Deuce, even if Deuce hasn't been hitting Lake, like Lake herself has, you could say that Lake was provoked. I don't really, and I feel like we can all agree that, like, in romantic relationships, any type of violence is just never going to be called for. But I feel like some people would feel like, Juice maybe shouldn't have fucking impersonated her dead father's last words to her. Both, like, they were like Webb's last words on Earth and also Webb's last words to the lake, if I remember correctly. Like, Jesus, man, I don't know. Like, I don't know how I would handle I would probably not handle that well either, I guess, is what I'm getting at in some ways. That's just, it's really good writing. It's climatic in a way that Pynchon often can kind of not be. And there is an element of, if Lake had killed Deuce, that would have been even more climatic. But I don't blame Pynchon for not going there. And I do think that in some ways it's more interesting that Lake is going to have to deal with Deuce for longer in this book. As much as I don't like them, it is kind of like reality TV a little bit, where it's like a train wreck you can't stop like watching, where there's such a fucked up, their dynamics are so fucked up that it's just interesting, I guess. Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify that line that you weren't sure on. Dead carts, jack and hammer in his hand. There are two ways I read that. One is that basically high grading in that context means like uh, pocketing the higher quantity ore, or the higher quality ore, because if it's low quality ore, you stealing it doesn't really matter. So you high grade it, you pocket the high graded ore. And the jack and hammer, I think it's just a jackhammer, like an early jackhammer. So he's just saying that he was a dead man walking. We were sure we did it on spec, but hey, we were getting hired at some point, hypothetically. And I think the alternative way to read that, I suppose, is that he and Sloat were high grading for the company in a way that is a little less intuitive, because it's not a mining use. It means like for like procuring high quality things for, like, usually it's a lumber. It's not really relevant. But I think you could read that as him and Sloat were the ones who were doing high grading. They were doing the sniff test for the ore, the laborer with the highest quantity of danger for the company. They took him out. So yeah. Otherwise, I really appreciate you walking through your thoughts on the fight, because I think it got at some interesting points.
All right, so that brings us to the end here. Were there any funny parts that we wanted to talk about that didn't get mentioned as we were going through it?
I mean, like, kind of every other line that Moss Gatlin delivers is pretty funny in a
Fair,
funny
yeah.
way. And I mean, the whole idea of a town built on the remains of a carnival is just, I mean, the thematic bullshit aside, it's funny. It's a good idea. Not good, but it's a good idea for a plot point.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I feel like there's a good amount less humor in these two chapters than as usual, or in 35. I guess in 34, there's a good amount of like Mava being at least semi-funny or comedic. I don't know. The dream sequence is also Lake's dream sequence. It's maybe more absurd than funny, but absurdity can be funny. Like it's not laugh out loud funny, but it is kind of vaguely, like I said, absurd in a way that kind of reminds me of some comedy type cartoon stuff that I've seen. I don't know.
Yeah. The last bit I can remember is I think it's really funny in that bit that I think Luke was alluding to in saying that it is as though Estrella had some kind of after sex glow on her. There's just a line where all the waitresses are like glaring at her, and it's ambiguous in a way that it seems like I think you're supposed to assume like half of them are super attracted to her and wish they were with her, and the other half just wish that she weren't there stealing the limelight. And that's just funny structurally.
Mm-hmm. Do we have say everyone have a quote that they want to share? Obviously, we read a lot out, but there's plenty to choose from in these chapters.
I'll go first, I guess. Mine's on 473. Although there's so many in these two chapters, which I'm sure we'll all probably say, but there's just a lot of great prose. And I actually maybe like some other of parts better prose wise, but I just really like this paragraph that I'm going to read out for different reasons. Although the language is great in this one too. When Deuce had left this part of the world just a youth, geography had favored the vectorless. From any patch of these plains, there was more than enough compass for vanishing. Roads of flight could just aim off along any heading into terrain far from maps even yet. Wild West or decadent East, north to the gold fields, down into old Mexico, all angles between. Like, for whatever reason, it does kind of remind me a little bit of just like the American highway system and just the feeling of driving in parts of the Midwest that I've been through in the Great Plains, where it just kind of feels like you're in the middle of this like vast land, and wherever you go, there's just an endless amount of land in whatever direction you head, which is obviously not true, but I feel like that's just kind of a sensation that you could have in the middle of the American continent. And it does. I mean, we went over this some with Mason and Dixon. I probably have mentioned some of this some with Against the Day as well. But yeah, you used to be able to like if you drive around America today, like on highways and stuff, especially through rural areas, you're gonna see a lot of fences and barbed wire, especially in Texas, actually. But even in Colorado, you'll see it. In other places, I mean, from what I remember of New York, you'll see it. Not New York City, but the state. Where like you can't just kind of pick a direction and walk in it endlessly. But I feel like in the past, this is maybe kind of the tail end of there being at least sections of America that aren't national parks that you can just kind of drift through without necessarily taking a road and not having to fear too much about getting shot like you would today.
It's that damn devil's wire.
My quote comes from 483. It's amidst all of this stuff about Lake wishing she could return to a different part of her life. And I can never leave him, she wrote in the little school copybook she used for a diary. No matter what he does to me, I have to stay. It's part of the deal. Can't run. Sometimes like I'm trying to wake up and can't, and I already knew, didn't I? Long before we married. Who he was. What it was he did. And yet I went ahead and married him. I didn't know, but I knew. Maybe for the first time I caught him looking at me, there was that bright-eyed excuse for a smile. Like we were well-known figures of public life and each of us was supposed to know who the other was. And not lift a finger, either one. Even with all we knew. Some deal we made. With the empty spaces always in between how I ought to be feeling and what I was really up to. It was sneaking away to Silverton all over again, and nobody saw it. I thought I was just grieving for Pa or trying to keep busy. They told me time would pass and I'd get back to daily life, but I think I'm dreaming and can't wake up. Wish it could be Denver. Be a saloon girl. She crossed out the words, but went on daydreaming about it. Old dime novels full of lurid goings on, chandeliers and champagne, men whose faces were never too clear. Pain that felt just so good, imagined in detail. Girl intimates who lay around in fancy linen, sharing laudanum on long, slow winter nights. A loneliness nothing could touch, an embrace of distant, empty rooms kept clean by the wind forever blowing through. A high mountain sunlit spareness, a house framed in absolute rectilinear purity. Dry, bleached, silent but for the wind. And her young face, remembered by 100 no-goods all through the San Juans, for its clean delicacy, unshielded before the days and what they were doing to it. I mean, I don't know. I could talk about that passage for probably another hour, just in terms of the imagery used and the way it's written, the way in which it mimics how she talks, and the fact that I believe it was Luke who said there's probably some missing punctuation there to indicate that it's a journal entry and not being written by a professional author, and just every kind of turn of phrase representing again this like turmoil that she is in as she is turning over her mind, trying to understand what to do and what to make of this situation that she's ended up in. It is the rare level of introspection that a novel not only aspires to include in its pages but also achieves. Like, it is very hard to do this kind of writing in a way that is not overtly just like exposition, right? Or telling instead of showing, to use kind of a workshop phrase. And the fact that Pynchon is able to do it, like, not just here, but across these 30 pages that we're covering for this episode, and make it build and twist and represent the spiritual wrestling that the character is so clearly undergoing, is just nothing short of incredible. And I if I continue talking, I'm not going to shut up. So I'm just going to stop there.
I mean, all that's well and good, but if you consider that Pynchon doesn't write real characters, they're
You know
not
what? You're
believable.
right. You're right. He's just not. He can't do it.
It's like cartoons, you know.
And all of his women are really bad.
There's no depth to any of them. They're just there for male enjoyment. Just I want to clarify. I'm going to read the big paragraph on 463. We didn't read that one out, right?
I don't
The
think
one with the Indian bee twins.
so. No.
And I guess for my quote, I will pick on 463. Frank found he couldn't sleep. Or, well, actually, you know what? I said that it sounded like a Western accent, so I'm going to try and do that. Frank found he couldn't sleep and headed down to the nearest saloon. Out in front, where once only horses had been tied, now stood silent gray fellows and Indian V-twins, modified expressly for these mountains, with heavy-duty clutches, belts, chains, or gearboxes. All up and down Main Street in these motor saloons mingled trick-riding artists up from the prairie carnival circuits for a little change of ventilation, and peach-fuzz desperados singing the harmony to Joe Hill's Pie in the Sky for ancient flat-out labor nihilists on whose palms love-lined lifelines, girdles of Venus and such had been years overmapped into jagged white inscriptions no carnival gypsy would dare to read, but wood fires, rock walls, barbed wire, and spooling too fast, bayonets and the bullpins of the Coeur d'Alene, motorized elements of the notorious Four Corners gang, based up in Cortez, bought double shots at Taos Lightning for earnest hobbyists from as far away as Kansas, detached not all against their wills from some club tour or other, out and up through the night, talking clutches and crankcases till the sun was in the window. It's just kind of great. Like,
Yeah, it
I
is.
don't know. It's not even necessarily like it's not imagery. It's just it's Pynchon doing his list thing to great effect. Like
Yeah.
it's awesome, and it all he's doing is detailing the things around him, but it feels like there's momentum. It feels like things are happening. It's awesome, and it's really pretty sounding too, especially if you sound like you got punched in the mouth while you were looking for gold. But it's also just, you know, it's nice to have the mention of Taos Lightning, which let's be clear, the Pynchon Wiki is ambiguous about this. Taos Lightning is
One
not.
of the worst entries on the Pynchon Wiki is for that mention.
Yeah, I mean, it's just basically Taos Lightning these days is a brand of whiskey, and at some point there was a bottler and a distiller up by Taos that made like Taos whiskey like the by name for Western whiskey. But Taos Lightning was like a thing that was come up with in like dime novels, as far as I can tell, in like around the time this is set. And so it's not an anachronism to have it be mentioned, but it is that's not what it was called, and it's essentially product placement at this point, which is fine, but that's what it is, especially since it's capitalized.
That's all well and good, but have you considered that it might just be from Star Trek?
No, I'm not gonna consider that ever. It doesn't make
Okay.
any sense because again, it's like if you look up like less than scrupulous reporting, they will say that Taos Lightning is a word that was or a name that was used all the way back in like the 1830s, and it was not a phrase that was used. Mountain Dew was used for what they're calling Taos Lightning, um, and yeah, just making that clear. But it's nice to have a mention to the New Mexican whiskey world. It's pretty much dead these days, but hey, you know.
You could bring it back, Will.
Well, there is okay. Unfortunately, there is competition. It's just that like they all buy MGP grain, and
Oh, sure.
just disappointing when Texas is nearby, and like Texas has so much diversity.
So much diversity and so much interesting like craft whiskey happening now too, in terms of small distillers that aren't using MGP.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like I've been obsessed with Balcones like blue corn single malt for the last while because it literally
Yeah.
it tastes like lightning in the way that like the stories about moonshine are, which is not true with like true moonshine. But that shit does.
Yeah, agreed. That is a really, really great release of theirs. Although I can't say that I've had many Balcones whiskeys that I didn't think were good. They're pretty solid across the board.
I would just buy one of their bottles sight unseen for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that brings us to most pinch on part of the chapter. What do we got for this one?
I'll be very short, I promise. Mine is the choice to not only have Groucho Marx pop up, but to specifically have him hold the. I smoke Havanas mostly, but I wouldn't mind one of those. It's just it's so Pynchon in tone because it is so Marx Brothers in tone, and it's just great.
Mine is just the character work, I guess. I mean, we've been over this some, but it is a very Pynchon thing to do to introduce a character early or relatively early in a book and have them not be super fleshed out or have a lot of presence on the page, and then later in the book to flesh that person out and give that person more presence on the page. And that's something he can kind of maybe sometimes scan as a bit random in terms of how he chooses his spots when it comes to that. I'm not like really sure that. I think it's more. He's probably. I doubt that he has like a what's the word, like an outline where he's like, oh, in 200 pages I'm going to flush out Mava. He seems like more of a vibes guy. I don't know, but it is interesting how he kind of picks his spots with that, and it's just a very kind of quirky Pinchonian thing to do to pull stuff like that.
My most pinch on part of the chapter comes right before Will's quote that he read, and it's Strange motorcycles, many of them homemade, went roaring raggedly into and out of town. Cowboy poets might allege how the noise echoed off the steep mountainside, quote unquote, and on down the valley. But right on the spot, why, it was too exotic a sound to carry much of any message, at least for no more than a few, though certain taverns on the way in, and even some going out of town, had already offered hospitality to the bands of riders. It's primarily that quote at the beginning of just like, if you were reading a dime store novel, essentially, or one of these dime westerns, then maybe it would use the phrase this. Like, he is doing a dime store pastiche in a lot of these sections, or a dime novel pastiche in a lot of these sections. So for him to be writing that, step out of the voice for a second to criticize a cliche of those novels' description, and then just go right back into his own writing, it is such a distinctly Thomas Pynchon thing to do in my mind.
Can't argue there.
All right, we have two messages to read out that we received on Ko-Fi. I think this is the first time that we have ever had messages from fans on Ko-Fi. I will read the first one from Blake, and then if one of you guys wants to read the second one that came in from Sebastian Michaels.
I can read the second one.
Okay. So first we have a message here from Blake on Ko-Fi who says, "Hey all, I do not have the socials to communicate in those spaces, so I hope this finds its way to you. I just finished listening to Chapter 8's pod of Against the Day and Kate's absolutely spectacular summation of the events in the hills of Colorado and in the West. In an unshocking and deeply saddening moment of synchronicity, the following has just occurred today in Colorado." And he linked to a article from the Colorado Sun about an overtime wage bill from the Colorado Senate. "What is truly deflating as a thing to see repeat itself 120 odd years later, but in the true Lovecraftian horror version of it in the present. The formalized, the bureaucratized version of the same process miners faced in the hills of state. I won't linger too long on this here, as y'all are light years beyond in both the book and I am sure in readings elsewhere. Nonetheless, in a similar way, this is a call from the past to present in the book. I too hearken from the dark ages of Chapter 8 with dark ties to the light of this day. As I said before, I am deeply appreciative work y'all are doing. I am very grateful to have a space for some form of discourse with this stuff. It is a true testament to your work's quality that even displaced the discourse feels engaging and authentic on my end." Thank you, Blake. Not just for the compliment on my summation of the labor history of Colorado. I remember that was a particular sort of marathon of research that I had to do back in those portions of the book. I hope that you stick with us through Chapter 9 and all the way through to the 30s where we are now, in which case, hello from your present, but our past, when you get to this message that we are leaving you. And just, genuinely thank you for telling us that our discourse feels authentic and engaging. I think that that's ultimately probably what all of us are attempting to do. None of us want to come across as like overly stuffy or pretentious or anything like that. And I think to have that be felt on the other end shows that we're doing what we kind of set out to do in making these books more accessible, but also just providing a space for us to be able to talk about them.
All right, so our second Ko-Fi is from Sebastian Michaels. One thing I wanted to ask, in the Crying of Lot 49 Chapter 3 episode, and really the bonus episode on the play within the novel specifically, you don't mention just how weird it is that the play would involve multiple things that tie directly in with the main character's life. Like all those bones being brought up and used to make something, but there are several other rather straightforward points that match something we've seen up to that point in the novel. Maybe it's just Pynchon being Pynchon, but how can that possibly be taken as realistic by the characters attending the play? Kind of like King Claudius watching the dumb show and play within the play in Hamlet. It portrays exactly the way he killed his brother, the former king of Denmark, but he at least reacts to the performance of that play. Presumably. There's also a theory that it is only Hamlet's antics that he's reacting to. But in Crying, there are clearly points in that play that shouldn't realistically have been possible for the original playwright or even the current director to have included, right? I think you are correct. I do think I remember at least maybe not as concise and well put as you stated it, as Sebastian stated it. But I do remember thinking along those similar lines. I don't remember why I didn't bring it up. I mean, those were early days. We have talked about, I mean, we can cut this part, but we have talked about, redoing those episodes or going back over Crying in Block 49. You make a good point. I mean, I think I remember just thinking that it was just kind of another level of just like, I mean, it's unclear if the play, to me at least, and it's been a while since I've read Crime Block 49, but it's been 2 or 3 years, I think. 2 years, maybe. 2.5. Anyway, I do remember, like, it's unclear if that play, you could interpret that play, or you could come up with a conspiracy corner type thing that play was just written perhaps just to fuck with Oedipa, that it's all been fabricated, the entire history of it being a play, like the entire history of it existing could have been fabricated from what I remember. I mean, I think a lot of the information that we get on the play is from a book. That you can fabricate books, you can fabricate old books. You could have done that in the 60s even. And some of it comes from, I believe, like the bookshop owner, question mark, I think, who, he works in, that bookshop is in San Narciso, I want to say. And that whole town could have been owned by Pierce, could still be owned by whoever is conducting the big conspiracy around Oedipa, if you interpret it that way. I mean, that book is just, it's weirdly dense for it being so short. It's weirdly hard to wrap your head around for being so short. In a weird way, I feel like I have a better grasp of Gravity's Rainbow than I do of Crime Block 49. And that's kind of a crazy thing to say, I feel like, but I do think it's true, for me at least. Where I just kind of struggle with the Crying About 49 and how to piece it all together, and if I even should try, But I do think that the interpreting it as perhaps all, I mean, it's just unclear what's reality and what's fabricated in that book in general. So, is my rather maybe long-winded and not terribly well phrased answer.
Yeah, I would like to add on a little bit to that and just say that I think the reason we didn't express it explicitly is that you're kind of talking about the whole point of the book. Like sure, there are events in the novel up until the point of the play where, as the reader, it's clearly mirroring things. But the actual substance of that being the case is Oedipus having her jaw drop to the floor talking about it. And as the readers, we have a limited perspective. We basically only have access to what Oedipus is exposed to. And so the entire premise that these are like obvious events that would ring true to anyone sitting in the play or sitting in the audience. Well, I mean, when was the last time you went to a Shakespeare play? Because if you are engaging like in the same way that you engage with Pynchon's novels, you will start to see things that are happening in your life around you on stage too. Like that's part of what this whole fiction meaning making is. And so in a way, like, yeah, that's the point of the play, is to be this receptacle for all of these symbols that we can't verify in any way. And the fact that other points of view in the book don't recognize the absurdity of that, I think is why there's the drama at all. If it were just Oedipa finding an interesting historical rabbit hole, she would have just opened an encyclopedia. You wouldn't have the tension of what's real and what's not. You wouldn't have the tension of Oedipa perhaps being psychotic at certain points. You wouldn't have the doubt of the epistemology of the world of the book. Instead, you would just have a kind of a just so story about a woman losing her mind.
All right. Thank you to all of the listeners who wrote in. If you are interested in joining their ranks, you can do so through a number of ways. Apparently, you can send messages on Ko-Fi. So if you want to do that, go ahead and do that. But otherwise, you can also email us at pinchonpod@gmail.com it's really late. You can reach out to us on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Pod. You can reach out to us on Twitter at PinchOnPod, on Blue Sky at Mapping the Zone Podcast. We are also available on YouTube, so you can leave comments. We read those off as well. And if you are interested in supporting our show, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. One is by donating directly to our show through our Ko-Fi link. Any funds that you do send our way will be used to pay for our hosting fees and any other expenses that may come up in the process of producing this show. And the other way, if you want a piece of tangible merchandise in exchange for your goods of monetary value, Jesus, it's getting late, is to go to our spread shop, and we have shirts and we have all sorts of ephemera there that you can get our logo put on. Next episode, we are going to be covering the next 2 chapters of Against the Day. That'll be 36 and 38. In case you do happen to have a copy of the book with a different pagination, that is going to bring you to the line. It felt like she was standing still. She had never even heard of this place. Never mind Kit for the moment. Where was she? But that is where we're going to end up. If you're interested in engaging with the different members of this show and in other ways, I have started a Substack. You can find me on there at Fostering Kate, where I post occasional essays or short pieces of fiction or creative nonfiction. And Luke, you have a literary magazine that you like to post on. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I run Just Keep Up magazine. It's we publish sci-fi and horror, fiction and poetry, generally on the more experimental and weirder side. A lot of times, with some exceptions, a lot of what we publish is also short or not terribly long. Although our submission guidelines, they're like people have submitted novels because I didn't specify a word count. Anyway, yeah, I mean it's fun to I enjoy running it, and I do I do think that we have published some pretty quality stuff. We nominate for Best of the Net, and we're planning on nominating for the Pushcart Prize and perhaps a few other awards this year, and may eventually try to put out some type of print edition or print like omnibus of what we published, but we'll see. Yeah. Thanks, Kate, for bringing that up.
Of course. And as always, thank you all for listening.
But hi.
See ya.
Bye.